My name is Michael Name. I'm the superintendent of Mineola. On behalf of the Board of Education, I'd like to welcome you to Mineola High School for what we hope is a productive afternoon. I'd like to thank all of my colleagues who helped plan this afternoon and the forum. In addition, I'd like to thank Matt Pomara from Core BTS for providing the live stream for everyone that was unable to join us in the auditorium. As you can see, we went to great lengths to welcome the commissioner. We built a set for him. If you're interested in real theater, November 22nd and 23rd, The Heiress, performed by our talented students. Tickets are available outside. At this time, I'd like to welcome our student organization president, Mr. Jacob Escobar, to welcome our guests.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the students and myself, we would like to welcome Commissioner John King, Chancellor Merryl Tisch, State Senator Jack Martins, educators, parents, and community members. Please be respectful of each other and the questions that are asked. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're here for an education forum today, right? Good afternoon. Excellent. Just a little bit about the framework for today. The process is going to be, I will call individuals, the questions will be posed here from this podium. We have Felicia and Pollock here in the front row who will be keeping time. I'm going to ask you to keep the questions to a minute. I'm going to ask the commissioner that we keep the answers to 2 minutes. We have received literally hundreds of questions to ask, and we're going to try and get through as many of them this afternoon as we possibly can. So I'd like to keep it to a certain clip. So the questions will be here, answers, timekeepers there. As the moderator, I will take the prerogative of follow-up if need be, or if I feel it's appropriate. But certainly, I'm looking forward to an opportunity for a good give and take as it comes to the 4 major issues that we're all dealing with. We've broken down this session into 4 issues, 4 different slots, so to speak. The first is on Common Core and the Common Core rollout. Second, APPR. Third, testing and opt-out. Fourth, student privacy. 4 issues, 4 different sections, and we'll keep the questions flowing with respect to each one because I think each one of those issues is important to our education community and certainly to our schools, our teachers, and our educators. To start then, well, before we start, let me take the opportunity to thank Commissioner King. Dr. King, thank you very much for being here. Thank you for allowing us the opportunity to have this forum, and thanks for joining us in Nassau County and more specifically here at the Mineola High School. Thank you. And to our Chancellor, Chancellor Tisch, good to see you here. Thank you very much as well. Thank you for joining us for these forums. As we all know, it's important that we have you and the Board of Regents here as well. Thank you for your commitment to education. Thank you also for being here at the Mineola High School for this forum. To the Mineola Board of Education, to the school district, to the student government, and to everyone here who made this forum possible, thank you. To the 15 superintendents and 15 school districts in the 7th Senate District that participated in putting this forum together and cooperated and met and deliberated and helped in putting this format together, thank you for all of your help and all of your input as well. So let's get started. first topic that we'll cover is Common Core Standards, Curriculum, and Rollout. And the first question will be posed by Gina DeRocha from Mineola. Gina, please come up. And what I will ask is that I will call the person who's on deck and ask them to come up so that we can move a little more quickly. The next person up will be Sheila Simone, President of the Great Neck Teachers Association.
Okay. My question is geared to, and I'm here to represent, only 2 to 3 of the student population, and those are the students with severe cognitive disabilities, and how they're affected by the Common Core. As outlined in the New York State learning standards for students with disabilities, students with severe disabilities have limited cognitive abilities combined with behavior and or physical limitations and require highly specialized educational, social, psychological, and medical services in order to maximize their full potential for useful and meaningful participation in society and for self-fulfillment. Previously, alternate performance indicators on a basic functional level of age 5 were developed to reflect appropriate educational outcomes for students with severe disabilities. Now, teachers of students with severe disabilities utilize extensions aligned with the Common Core standards. So a teacher with a class of 7th grade equivalent severely disabled students has to teach these students to recognize text that contains an argument and or a claim, to recognize the main idea in diverse media, to add and subtract fractions, decimals, and percentages as some of the examples that they need to teach. So my question is, please tell me how those lessons mentioned above are useful, meaningful, and appropriate for students who are cognitively functioning at a 5-year-old or younger level and have severe cognitive and medical disabilities which impact their educational outcomes.
Thanks for the question. Let me first thank Mineola School District for hosting us and our Mining for hosting this evening's conversation, and all of you for taking the time to be here for this discussion. The alternate assessment is challenging to design because there is a range of student ability levels within that 1%. One of our broader challenges around students with disabilities is that the category students with disabilities is used to describe students that range from those with severe cognitive impairments all the way to students who need modest once-a-week speech services, and all of those students are captured in the same category. What the department tried to do with the alternate assessment, based on feedback and guidance from educators from around the state, was that for every task to have a range, for every standard to have a range of tasks that students could do that would be appropriate to their developmental level. We're just starting this work on the new alternate assessment, again, guided by educators from around the state. There will be an opportunity throughout this year for continued discussions on professional development and adjustments along the way as we try to make sure that students who are taking the alternate assessment who are have the most severe cognitive disabilities aren't asked to do things they can't do. But at the same time, that students who can do more are able to demonstrate that on the alternate assessment. The criticism that we heard from teachers and principals who serve students with disabilities of the alternate assessment was that the old version of the alternate assessment didn't give enough activities to cover the full range within that 1% of students that are allowed to take the alternate assessment. So, but we can certainly follow up more afterwards on the specifics of the alternate assessment design. We can certainly follow up with our regional special ed technical assistance center, but there's actually a range of ways that students can demonstrate.
It still doesn't go low enough to meet needs of these students, and it is pretty much useless.
We should talk more about that. The goal is for it to be useful, so we should talk more about
It's
that.
not meaningful or useful.
I'm going to then ask that I guess we've got a commitment that you're going to review those. Certainly there are concerns with regard to our children with special needs that frankly, the general consensus is that they may not necessarily be fairly tested, and that they're unfortunately falling through the cracks, and we have to do better. And certainly, Commissioner, if we can get a commitment that you're going to review those, we'll follow up on those. Thank you. Next up, we have the president of the Great Neck Teachers Association, Sheila Simone, on deck. We have Larry Bernstein, from a member of the Board of Education for the Port Washington School District. Sheila.
Commissioner, you've repeatedly asserted that the purpose of state assessments is to improve classroom instruction. When I give my students a test, I analyze the results item by item, student by student, in order to determine what specific areas of my instruction need improvement and what specific skills or concepts my students need to work on. Despite the massive statewide drop in test scores for grades 3 through 8 last year, teachers have not been given this information for the students who took the test. How then can the assessments improve classroom instruction?
Thank you for the question. Let me describe what is available for analysis of last year's assessments. Actually, more information than almost any state in the country shares about their assessments. We provided 25% of the items that are released, the actual questions, the correct answers, the incorrect answers, an explanation of why the correct answers were correct and why the incorrect answers were incorrect, examples of student work. We also provided test blueprints that are incredibly detailed, the most detailed the state has ever published, that describe the criteria that are used for selecting each of the items, as well as the criteria that are used for selecting each of the passages that are used on the assessments. At the RICs, the Regional Information Centers, or the data centers at each district, each of the big 5 districts, they can provide schools, and have been providing schools, with item-level analysis. The same item-level analysis that has been available in the past. The difference between the 3-8 assessments and the Regents exams, all items are released. With the 3-8, it's 25% of items. The reason is that it's twofold. One, the more items you release, the more field testing you need to do. And one of the things that the board has asked us to do is to try to limit the field testing as best we can. One thing the board discussed at their last meeting is a potential budget request that would allow us to print more forms of the test so that we could further reduce the need for field testing. So one reason we limit it to 25%, which is not atypical among states, is to manage the cost and scale of field testing. The other reason, and more important, is so that the test items don't become the curriculum. What we don't want is for last year's test to become the curriculum. The standards have to be the curriculum. And so states have this decision, this balance to strike between releasing items and providing a good sense of what the test looks like, and not allowing the test to define the instruction that students receive, but rather the standards. But we have heard the request, and it's not uncommon, to release more items, and we're going to work with the governor and legislature to determine if we can get the resources, again, to try and reduce field testing and give us more flexibility there.
The 25% that you have released doesn't take into the 75% that you haven't. And that's the bulk of the test. Furthermore, if the item analysis isn't tied to my own students, how can I know what my students can do and can't do?
You can get student-level item analysis. The question but with only 25% of the items, the other items are described by standards, not the actual item itself.
I will tell you as a teacher, I find this absolutely unhelpful in terms of improving my own instruction.
Next up, we have Larry Bernstein from the Port Washington Board of Education, who will be followed by David Chancellor, who's an 11th grader in the Roslyn School District.
First of all, I'd like to thank thank Senator Martins for holding this forum, and Dr. King and Chancellor Tisch for coming down and listening to our concerns. The Port Washington School District, like Long Island, is very economically and culturally diverse community. We are a true melting pot, and that has guided our instruction and assessment protocols for decades. Every year, well over 90% of our students continue their education, some being first in their families to do so. Our retention rate is over 90% each year, which indicates that our students are college and career ready. What data do you have to show that the State Education Department's instructional and assessment protocols are better than ours for preparing our students for life after high school? Not continue to be able to use our proven instructional and assessment protocols instead of adopting your untested and unproven strategies?
Districts should use their own assessments. The question is, how should states implement their responsibility to have a common assessment across schools and districts? When Elementary and Secondary Education Act was first being adopted by Congress, Robert Kennedy spoke to this issue of the need for a common standard for the sake of equity, to be able to assess how students are doing against a common set of standards. The federal law gives that responsibility to states. We are required to provide assessments in 3rd grade, 8th grade English language arts and mathematics, in science at the elementary and middle level, and then an English, math, and science exam at the high school level. That's federal law. We have to provide those assessments. I think it's a great step forward for the country that 45 states, the District of Columbia, and the Department of Defense schools have come together around a common set of standards that reflect college and career readiness. Those standards reflect decades of research. They reflect the expectations of the gold standard NAEP assessment. They reflect the guidance of K-12 educators, higher education faculty, and business leaders from across the country. And that's what's reflected in the Common Core and the standards that we use to design our assessments. But they are one of multiple measures that should be used to assess performance, whether it's for accountability purposes for schools and districts, or for teacher and principal evaluation purposes, or for the purposes of making judgments about student performance.
What data do you have to show that your tests are predictive of future success?
Okay. Well, last year was the first year of implementing those assessments, but we do have longitudinal data on, for example, the Regents exams that shows that the Regents exams are quite a strong predictor of whether or not students enroll and succeed in credit-bearing courses. Now, over time, we will build similar data about the Common Core 3rd grade, 8th grade assessments, although I should say the NAEP assessments, which establish a proficiency rate for New York that is almost identical to our state assessment proficiency rate. The NAEP assessment just completed a very large longitudinal study that showed that where the NAEP sets the standard for proficiency, it's a very strong predictor of student success in college and careers. So there is a substantial body of evidence, and there will be more over time.
Thank you.
I've heard a little comedy on this thing. The question came up as to how these tests, as to how the tests were built. Commissioner, you said that educators across the state participated in the building of the exam. Karen said on a little Twitter. Could you give us 30 seconds on how educators across this state participated, 1 second, in building these exams?
Sure, as long as you're teachers and principals. Can you hear me or no? Yeah. Okay. As long as you're New York, teachers and principals and educators at all levels are involved in multiple stages of the assessment design. For every subject area, we have content panels that are comprised of educators from the entirety of K-12 as well as higher education who advise the department on the content of exams. There are educators who are involved in the design of the assessment items. There are educators who are involved, New York State educators who are involved in the reviews of the items and the final review of the items before the test is complete. So there are multiple stages of educator involvement in the design of the assessments, both the third to eighth grade assessment and the Regents exam. All of the items are also field tested. So the items are administered in New York State schools. The performance of students is evaluated on those field tests before the items are made operational in the operational test.
Thank you, Commissioner. Before we get to our Roslyn High School 11th grader who has our next question, I just wanted to reiterate a point that was just made. There are other metrics to determine whether or not our children, our students are college and career ready. And certainly if we have school districts that have 80 plus, or in some instances 90 plus % of their students going on to four-year colleges and then going on graduating from those four-year colleges in 4 years, there's a good argument to be made that 80 or 90% of those kids who graduated from that school are college and career ready, as opposed to some of the statistics that we've heard. And so we would ask that you take the opportunity to reevaluate the metric that has been disseminated out there, that we have a vast majority of our students who are not college and career ready, because that doesn't necessarily apply across the board. That's 11th grader, Roslyn High School. We have Regina Rule, who's the president of the Board of Education for the Manhasset School District.
Thank you. The Common Core curriculum that is being implemented throughout the elementary levels is based on the assumption that all students have the same learning capacities. With the current curriculum, students, including myself, were taught the material in different ways based upon their ability to learn. How is the Common Core curriculum effective if it doesn't propose a way to handle elementary grade students who can't keep up as well as others with the uniform curriculum?
I appreciate the question. It's really important to make the distinction between Common Core standards and curriculum. The Common Core standards that we've adopted along with 45 other states are just that, standards. They lay out what students should know and be able to do at each grade level so that they're on a path to college and career success. The curriculum is decided locally, and we want the curriculum to do exactly what you're describing. The question was very well asked. We want the curriculum to do exactly what you're describing, meet the needs of individual students. What I saw at Mineola Middle School, which we visited today, is an incredible degree of differentiation, where teachers are thoughtfully using a variety of instructional strategies, including technology, to try and ensure that students are getting the support they need that meets their individual needs. Now, we are providing at the state level a set of curriculum materials as a resource for districts. They're not mandated, they're not required. They're a resource. But those materials have to be adapted to meet the needs of the students who are in front of the individual educator. They can't be treated as scripts. They have to be treated as a resource that then needs to be adapted to the needs of students. So what you're describing about a curriculum that meets the needs of individual students, that's exactly right. The standards set a level of expectations of what it looks like as students progress through the grade level. But it doesn't dictate what text needs to be read, what math exercises need to be done on a given day. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Regina Rule, president of the Manhasset Board of Education, followed by Genara DiGirolamo from the Harris School District.
Thank you, Commissioner King, Chancellor Tisch, and thank you, Senator Martins. Commissioner King, you have spoken about the importance of having local school districts allocate time and resources towards professional development to support teachers and administrators as they develop curriculum that meets students' needs and is consistent with the Common Core learning standards. I agree. Because time cannot be purchased or created, I urge you to slow down the implementation of the Common Core standards. Attended testing so that local school leadership teams can work with faculty to implement the standards correctly and well. Another problem is that current New York State legislation, combined with consistently increasing benefit costs and contractual obligations, severely constrain the ability of local school boards to freely allocate already limited resources. The 2% tax cap is no help either. How do you suggest that cash-strapped districts find the necessary resources to allocate to this critically important component of professional development and curriculum writing?
Thanks for the question. Let me start to clarify our role with respect to resources. State Education Department doesn't decide on the resources that go to schools, as I'm sure you know, but it's important to emphasize. The State Education Department makes a set of recommendations to the governor and legislature in the state aid proposal that comes from the Board of Regents. That recommendation is made typically in December, and then in January the budget cycle begins. And the governor proposes a budget, each house of the legislature responds, and a budget is negotiated that sets the state aid. That's not a role, that's not something that the department does. The department doesn't dictate the distribution of aid, although we make recommendations and have prioritized historically in our recommendations increasing equity in school finance and ensuring that resources are there for our highest needs students. There will be, I imagine, a robust debate about school aid in the coming legislative session. I'm sure the senator would point out, as with the rest of the legislature and the governor, that $1 billion or so was invested last year in additional state aid, but we are still below the levels that we were at in 2007-8 as a result of the fiscal crisis that faces the state and country. I wish I could say I thought huge new resources were on the way. I am hopeful about the current budget cycle, but I think the reality is we face a lot of constraints, economic constraints, declining enrollment in many communities, including on Long Island. And resources are going to continue to be a challenge. On professional development, I agree that we need to continue to invest in professional development and time for educators to work on curriculum materials, work to adapt curriculum materials to meet the needs of their students. Many of those decisions, as you know, are made locally, and many of them are made locally through collective bargaining about how much time is allocated to various activities. What the department can do is put resources that we have access to towards that work, and we've done that. Majority of our Race to Top funds go to districts to support professional development. Depending on how many Title I students the districts have, that means a lot of money or a small amount of money. As we get access to federal resources, we prioritize professional development. And we will certainly bring to the governor and legislature a conversation about how we might as a state invest more in professional development. This is not a one-year enterprise. Shifting the standards and expectations of every school in the state. It's not a one-year enterprise, not a 5-year enterprise, not a 7-year enterprise. It's a long-term project, and we've got to continue to invest over time. Now that said, on your point about slowing down, again, we changed the assessments for 3rd grade. We, like every state, face the dilemma. You keep giving the old tests based on the old standards, or you give new assessments based on the standards that you've asked your folks to teach in the classroom. In other states, the common complaint is, why are we still giving the old tests and holding schools and educators accountable to the old tests when we're supposed to be teaching to new standards? We made the change in the assessments for 3rd and 8th grade. This year, the change is to algebra for the class of 2017. They could opt to take the English assessment as well. And that class of 2017 will be the first to graduate with Common Core students. So we're another 4 years as we phase in the high school assessments. But we'll continue to emphasize the importance of professional development.
And partial phase-in, potentially. But as far as the limited resources, I am concerned that your ambitious agenda, which, as I said, I agree with, could be, it's a catch-22 for you all, to catch-22 for us, and we would hate to see limited resources, put our goals and hang them out to dry. Thank you.
Thank you. Next we have Gennaro DiGirolamo from the Herrick School District, followed by Janine Lenora, a 3rd grade teacher at New High Park School.
This new curriculum, or rather Common Core standards, and evaluations, created by corporate interests, push to state education is not educating future citizens of our country, but rather future consumers of the corporate entities involved. Gates Foundation, who invested $100 million to start up In Bloom Inc. News Corp, their wireless generation division, has been involved in creating this new database. Amazon, whose cloud servers are storing the data, and Pearson, among others. As of September 2013, the Gates Foundation has granted over $174 million to push its college readiness program, or Common Core. My major concern with this curriculum is the following. The corporate interests involved in creating and selling Common Core are the same corporate interests that are collecting data on our children and possibly sharing their personal information with other parties. How is this education and not marketing?
So I have to say, I disagree with the premise of the question. The Common Core, it's important that we try to have a constructive dialogue. The Common Core was developed by K-12 educators, higher education faculty, business leaders, coming together from across the country to try and identify the knowledge and skills that students need for college and career success. If you look at the ELA standards, for example, the areas of emphasis in the ELA standards reflect decades of research about what students need. They emphasize the development of vocabulary. We know, for example, from the Hart-Risley study that our poor students enter school with 30 million fewer words than our most affluent students. So the Common Core emphasizes vocabulary development. That's not corporate. That's about ensuring that students have access to the vocabulary that will enable them to succeed in college and careers. The English Language Arts standards emphasize the reading of both fiction and nonfiction. Well, we know that when students get to college, they are asked to read nonfiction texts in their science class, in their sociology class. If you look at the placement tests that are given to determine whether or not students take remedial classes, high school classes for which they and their families pay college prices, or allowed to take college classes, those placement tests emphasize nonfiction because higher education faculty expect students to be able to read nonfiction. Incorporating nonfiction into our standards isn't about a corporate interest, it's about trying to give students access. The emphasis on writing in the English Language Arts standards and research in the English Language Arts standards. It's not about corporate interest, that's about preparing students for college and career success. In mathematics, the standards reflect what we know from our strongest international competitors about math knowledge. The students I saw at Mineola Middle School today doing math, it wasn't about corporate interest. They were learning how to apply their math skills. The student was able to explain to the Chancellor why you need the zero as a placeholder in the math problem, what it means about place value. That's not about corporate interest. That's about learning math. Now, so on the Common Core, that's about a vision of trying to ensure students are prepared for college and career success. On the issue of data, and I know we're going to get to data more, so I'm going to go a little longer yes to two different questions. On the issue of data, the goal of the department's project around the data system, very straightforward, is to try to ensure that students in all districts and their families and their teachers have access to the kind of tools that are available in the most affluent districts in the state. In the most affluent districts in the state, many of them, parents can go on and log on to a parent portal. With a secure password, they can access information about how their child is doing in school, their grades, what the homework is, if they're having for lunch that day. Those tools are provided by third parties as a general matter. There's some company with which that district has contracted that's providing that tool. In the most affluent districts in the state, there are teacher portal tools for collecting curriculum materials, for sharing curriculum materials with other educators, for setting up assignments, and so forth. In other districts, they can't afford that tool. So the goal of the In Bloom project, which is a nonprofit, which yes, was funded by foundations, but the goal of the In Bloom project was to make it possible for states to lower the cost of those kind of data tools and to make them available in more districts with an emphasis on security. The data that's stored within Bloom is encrypted in storage, it's encrypted in transfers. The data security protections within Bloom are as high or higher than many of the third-party providers that are holding data for districts throughout New York and throughout the country.
Let's follow up on this. We have an entire section of our forum tonight that will be dedicated towards our student privacy, children's privacy, and in-room in particular. But I will interject here one point. I teach my kids all the time to be careful what you put online, because whatever you put online is there forever. And so I still have not figured out a way, nor has anyone demonstrated a way, that data that's online can be destroyed. It can be overwritten, but it's always there. And I think if we'll address it later in our forum, but the idea that there's material out there, that's aggregated, that's tied to a student, and that may be available at some point, it's being aggregated, I think, for a purpose. And we'll discuss that at a later point in today's forum, but I do appreciate the questions. Thank you. Next up, we have Janine Benora from the New Hyde Park. Who will be followed by Eileen Carrick, a parent from the Floral Park School District.
I just want to thank you for this opportunity, really to express a few concerns and ask 2 questions of you. You know the issues that have teachers, parents, students anxious and frustrated all over the state. You've been listening to them for quite some time now. You've been all over and you've heard from individual people many, many valid concerns about what is happening in our current education system. When you hear from these individuals, you're hearing from the front lines. You're hearing from those of us that are closest to the children and are attempting to implement the highest demands that have come upon us. And you're hearing from people that are witnessing some very negative things that are going on within our classrooms and within our school systems. I'm convinced after watching a number of these public forums that I join my voice with the concerns of many people across the state. We all seem to keep saying the same thing. The same issues keep coming again and again. We listen to how children are beset with anxiety and some don't want to go to school. We hear about how teachers don't have appropriate resources or training, and yet they're being tested on things they have not yet had a chance to teach. You hear the concerns about linking a teacher's job to a student performance on exams. I only now want to add my voice of concern to that of the other parents and teachers across the state. The reform in its current state needs to be reevaluated. And that's, I think, what we're hearing today. And I do appreciate hearing how you are reviewing some of the components of what's going on. Revisions need to be made based on the logical, legitimate concerns that parents, teachers, and students have. In its current state, I believe the system that is supposed to make our children ready, we run the risk of alienating some of them from the very education that they're supposed to be. Really this. Parents and teachers need to be heard. That is the biggest thing that I get from all of these meetings. We need to know that you hear us. And I don't know how you're supposed to do that, but that is one of my questions. How can your department really tell parents and teachers that you hear us, that you're not just placating us, that you're not just quoting statistics, but you really truly get the heart of the issue that we are facing with our children? And my second question is, and I've been hearing some answers to this second question, but when will the department actually begin to reveal a plan that reconciles our concerns with the agenda of the State Ed Department? Thank you.
Part of the challenge of trying to make sure that these forums and this state-wide discourse is productive is that there are decisions that rest with the state, and there are decisions that have to be made locally, and there are decisions that rest with the federal government, and all of those. And when I say the state, some that rest with the Board of Regents and the department, some that rest with the legislature and the governor. So some of the things that come up in these forums are things that we care about and agree with intensely, and the responsibility rests elsewhere. We've got to work together with parents and educators to try to advocate. Things like investing in early childhood education, ensuring that we have equity in school finance, etc. Some of the things are things that we can control. So we have to give assessments. We are required to give them, and have long given them since the 1860s, and expect we'll always give them. But where we have more testing than we need, we should change that. And so that's one of the reasons that we are working with the U.S. Department of Education to change the rules around 8th grade math, so that if students are taking the algebra Regents exam in 8th grade, they don't also have to take the 8th grade math test. The first question was about students with disabilities. We have 1% of the students that take the alternate assessment. We think there may be another portion of students where it may be of value to have students take assessments that are at their instructional level rather than their chronological age. But to make that change, potentially for another 2% of students, will require the permission of the U.S. Department of Education, will require them to interpret NCLB and IDA to allow that change. But that's a change that we're going to pursue. For English language learners, one of the challenges is that English language learners are required, after having been in the country a year, to take the assessment in literacy in English. Now, one thing that the board has asked us to explore is the possibility of allowing students to take assessments in their native language. So to develop assessments, for example, in Spanish, that students might take in their first couple of years before they transition to English language assessment. And that will require permission from the U.S. Department of Education and investment of resources from the governor and legislature, but that's something we're pursuing. So where we can make changes that are helpful, we will. But many of the changes that people are looking for have to be made at the local level. One of the things the board talked about at their last meeting was a grant initiative to help districts rethink some of their local assessment decisions. For example, many districts, as part of the evaluation process, decided to use pretest in order to assess student growth over the course of the year. But districts can instead use students' prior academic history to set goals for the year, as we would with the IEP process, for example. And so some districts around the state are eliminating pretests and using prior academic history instead. That's something that we are supporting and will continue to work with districts to address. Thank you.
Thank you. I know no reform is ever easy or smooth, but I think we need to know that we're on the same team here, and that you're not our enemy and we're not your enemy, because we're all achieving the same goal. We are trying to educate our children. That's why we're in this profession. Right now, it's perceived that your department is the enemy because of all the changes and all the implementation of all these things that are upon us. So somehow, if we can reconcile these issues and come together on this, it would be best for the children. Thank you.
Eileen Carrot for Parkdale, the school district, who will be followed by Antonia DiMaggio, a parent with the Franklin Square School District, John Street School.
Hi, this is sort of an extension of that last question, and specifically, what changes to the implementation of the Common Core state standards can we expect to see in the next 10 months?
So I'll describe some of the assessment changes that we're working on. At this stage of the implementation of the Common Core, and this is true not just for New York, but for the country, the real work is day-to-day in the classroom. When I was at Mineola Middle School today, teachers are engaged in the work of trying to figure out how to make the materials accessible to all students, not just some. They are engaged in the work of trying to help students who are struggling readers catch up and move forward. They're engaged in the work of collaborating with their peers to help parents with math homework, for example. We talked with Miss Gowrie, I think it was, who has designed these show me activities for math homework. So because parents have a lot of questions about the Common Core math homework, And so for each math homework assignment, the first question, there's a video that she does that explains the steps to solve the math problem, and that's sent home so that parents can access that, and they can then see the approach that's being taken in the classroom, and kids can see it. And now kids showed us, we sat with students who showed us that they too are making those videos and submitting them to the teacher so that she can hear their explanation of how they solve the math problem. That's the work ahead on the Common Core. The state's role, we have a role to support professional development. We've got hundreds of people in Albany today doing professional development around the Common Core so that they can bring that back to districts and regions. And we'll continue to do that. We'll continue to build instructional materials. We will continue to build a video library, which we've begun and engaged in more, of videos of great Common Core lessons and taken in classrooms around the state. We'll certainly come back to Mineola to take there. So we'll continue to build resources to try to support districts, and we'll certainly talk with the governor and legislature about the issue of resources for schools generally and resources for professional development specifically. In terms of the assessments, we're going to work with the governor and legislature on ways that we might reduce field testing, which I mentioned earlier. We're going to continue to look for ways that we can make sure that we have the assessment that we need and not more. And that's important at the state level with the assessments that we're responsible for, but also in working with districts on local assessment. Thank you.
Next, we have Antonio Blasio, who will be followed by Christine Corbett, President of the Westbury Teachers Association.
Last year, my daughter took the state test, and as I do always, I am a mother of a 4th grader and a 2nd grader. Last year, my older daughter took her state test, and as I do always, when she comes home for several weeks before the test, I asked her, how was your day? What did you learn? What did you do today at school? Her response was, we practiced for the state test, Mom. And I said, well, what else? And she said, well, we practiced, Mommy. So before the test, she would come home and she would cry and tell me that she was very anxious, she was overwhelmed, she didn't want to get her teacher in trouble because she didn't want to do bad on the test. Why are we doing this to these children? Why are we telling them? You have teachers telling you that they're teaching for these exams. I don't want to hear that as a parent. I want my children to have a positive learning experience. I enjoy going to school. I want my children to enjoy going to school. My daughters are an excellent student. Luckily she did great, but still, she was nervous. She was overwhelmed. I don't want that. I want her to be confident. I agree that I'm all for children being challenged. I think it's great, but I think you push the bar way too high. We're working towards how important parental support is at home. Do you know how frustrating, how stressful it is for a parent and a child to do homework when you cannot help them with a simple they're leaving boxes, they're estimating, and trying to figure out what strategy they used. I feel helpless because my kid, she burst into tears when I tried to explain the math the way I learned it. But that's not good, because she says, no, Mommy, I can't do it that way. I have to do it the way I learned it. So how are we supposed to help our kids? What do you say to us as parents, and what are we gaining from this?
I have the same concerns, I have to tell you. No one, it's really important. Look, no one at the State Education Department, no one in the Board of Regents wants rote test prep to crowd out good instruction. If you look at the resources that we provide, the professional development that we do, it is about engaging, hands-on learning. It's not about rote test prep. We don't support rote test prep, against rote test prep. I can't say it clearly enough. So the challenge is, we have a state law that we agreed to with the governor, the legislature, the statewide teachers union, that incorporates student performance as one of multiple measures of teacher evaluation and principal evaluation. And the idea is that a factor, not the sole factor, not the deciding factor, but a factor in how an educator is evaluated should be the growth, the academic growth that students are making. But to the extent that there is a perception that the idea is to evaluate teachers and principals on test scores alone, that's not, we've never asked for that, we've never wanted that, that's not our position, that's not what the law says. So I agree, we have work to do, not just as a state, but as a collection of 700 districts and as a state, to try to ensure that in every classroom that focuses on the engaging, compelling instruction that will lead students to be successful, not just on the assessments, but in life, and in college, and in careers, and as citizens. And so we've got work to do to ensure that that instruction is happening. But part of the reason I'm optimistic about the work on the Common Core is that I've visited more than 40 schools since the start of September, and that the right work is happening in classrooms around the state. And so the challenge is how do we create the right tone as a community of adults so that students aren't stressed about the test. They see it as a moment in time to demonstrate what they know so that their adults around them can support them in their success. We don't think the test should be used as the sole determinant of whether or not kids are promoted from grade to grade. So it should be one or multiple measures. We don't think the test should be the sole determinant of school district accountability. We think it should be one or multiple measures. We should look at graduation rates. We should look at the Senator Martin's point earlier. We should look at student success after they graduate when they go on to college and careers. So, I have to say that I share your core concern. And we are very committed to working with you, with others in this room, with local districts, to ensure that assessments play their proper role, part of the instructional cycle, but not the sole driver of instruction or decision making.
Next up, we have Christine Corbett from the Westbury School District.
My question is very similar to the parent before me.
Christine will be followed by Christine Cozzolino from the East Wilson School District, a parent of the East Wilson School District.
When did it become educationally sound to ignore the whole child in an effort for students to be college ready and career ready in elementary school? At what expense are our educational and our state leaders willing to gamble the childhood of students as young as 8 years old, who have already been turned off to school and no longer want to attend school?
No one wants that. No one's goal is to have students turned off from school or to ignore the whole child. If anything, in all the work that we do, again, around professional development and support to districts, our emphasis is on trying to address the needs of the whole child. When we talk about college and career readiness, we're not just talking about the skills for English and math. We're also talking about skills like perseverance and the ability to work effectively in teams with others and the ability to be an advocate for yourself, to getting the support you need when you're struggling. We're also talking about knowledge of careers and what's possible after school for you. Knowledge of different areas of study and a range of experiences. Department, the board have always advocated for the resources so that students can get a well-rounded educational experience in science, in social studies, in music, and art.
But we don't. Excuse me, hold on a second. Hold on a second, please. Let's take the opportunity to stick with the forum, but it's not going to be helpful if we have dialogue back and forth from the audience. I understand we're all passionate about this, but unless we stay to the forum, this is going to degenerate and nobody's going to benefit. Excuse me. I get it. I do. Thank you. I appreciate that.
So does everybody else here.
children back to the school that they're...
Thank you. I appreciate that. We'll continue after in life, but all of us are in the same boat. Let's not monopolize this event. Let's please wrap this up so we can allow the commissioner to continue. You and I can have this discussion after the floor. I appreciate it. Please continue.
The existence of a state assessment does not mean that instruction should be reduced to rote test prep. The assessment is a moment in time to assess where students are in their progress towards the standard. It should not define the instruction throughout the school year. What should define the instruction throughout the school year is meeting the needs of the whole child. Now that said, meeting the needs of the whole child includes helping students become strong leaders and strong problem solvers in math. I was in classrooms today, again, at Mineola Middle School, where students are getting integrated instruction between science and English language arts, where students' teachers are working together to ensure that students are able to read challenging texts about the science that they will then learn and apply in a science lab. That's the goal. The goal isn't to create an education system that's focused on rote test. We're against that.
Commissioner, the problem is, you're living in the world of theory, and most of us are living in the world of I'm also a parent, and the way this whole process was rolled out and shoved down these kids' throats, they weren't ready for this. That's what's creating the problem. It's not the professional development or lack of resources. Yeah, that's a problem too, but that's not what my question is about. My question is about that nobody thought about the kids. Nobody thought about how they were ready to receive this, and whether or not they have the tools to do so. I work in a district where 90% of the students come from poverty. Over 70% are English language learners. They're not ready for this. They feel defeated, demoralized. What's important here? Yes, I want my children to go to college. I want my students to be college ready. But I also want them to have a sense of self-worth.
I have to say, I disagree with you. I see a difference. I was in Westbury last year. At the dual language school, in classrooms where students were doing rich, engaging, Common Core instruction.
That's our best and our brightest. And we don't even talk about the kids that are struggling day to day. Forget about Westbury for a second. Let's just talk about children in general in the state of New York. They weren't ready for this. And we have more children now. Try to find a good therapist on Long Island right now. I heard a parent or another speaker ask, where are we going from here? What changes are going to be made? What you need to do, step back and halt. Halt. It's too much, too fast, too soon. But we rolled this thing out so quickly, with no professional development, no preparation for these kids. You should have rolled it out when you started in kindergarten and the world.
Just interject for a second. That's the core right there. We have 3 more sections we have to cover tonight, and your point was made, and I appreciate it, but I'll just leave it with this, and not to pile on. But we've got parents, students, teachers, educators, administrators on this side asking for the State Education Department to slow down. And on the other side, we have the State Education Department saying we need to move forward. And maybe it's an opportunity, and I'm sure you're not hearing it alone here, but you've heard it in other places. Would you make a commitment that you're going to look at the progress and how quickly this is proceeding, and perhaps take the opportunity to reevaluate?
So Senator, as the Chancellor has both communicated, lots of venues, we intend to make adjustments, but I have to say that there are, that what you're describing isn't true everywhere.
Let's do this. Let's take the opportunity to move forward, because there are some questions that are yet to be asked. We'll have an opportunity to wrap up at the end of the forum. Thanks for your question. Next speaker is Christine Cozzolino, who is a parent in the East Wilson School District. Christine.
I have 3 sons, one in kindergarten, one in 3rd grade, and one in 6th grade. I am also a high school and college math teacher. Teachers have always adhered to standards, and the United States continues to be the strongest nation in the world. Our forefathers led us to becoming this powerful nation by educating all the children with far less rigorous curriculum, less preparation materials, books, and certainly less testing. Our education system is not and has never been broken. My question for you is, if the point of elementary school education is to teach children how to think creatively, problem solve, be curious, learn from their mistakes, and develop a love of learning, how can we expect our children to be the innovators of the future when they are subject to these scripted lessons and the rigorous testing of the Common Core? My kindergartner has learned to write his numbers in a box that is smaller than an inch by an inch.
Few thoughts on that. One is, I don't think the notion that we can do better as a state and a country means that you're indicting all that has come before. It is to say that we as a state, for example, last year we graduated 74% of our students as a state. We can do better than that. Last year, a majority of the entering students in our community colleges were required to take remedial classes in the state. We can do better. That's not an indictment of anyone, that's not a criticism, that's just to say, collectively we can do better, and that's the vision behind the Common Core, is that we mean as a state and as a country to continue to do better, and that the demands of the 21st century require even more preparation for students to succeed in college and career. The materials that we've developed aren't scripted. In fact, on Engage New York, the professional development website that we built, the landing page for the curriculum material says these materials are not a script. We do make suggestions for how the materials could be delivered, but the decision making about how to use those materials has to be made local. This goes to the point I tried to make to the prior speaker. I'm in the 40-some-odd schools that I've been in since the beginning of the school year. I've been in elementary school classrooms where students, the Women Floyd district a few weeks ago. Students were having a great time doing math problem solving. They were doing math problem solving, they were using manipulatives. Higher standards doesn't have to mean rote test prep. Higher standards doesn't have to mean...
They have been teaching the standards from early on in the formation of our country. I don't understand what the push is right now with this. I really, really don't. And as an educator and as a parent.
I would say that what we know is there was a study done by CEOs for cities last year that showed that if we added a single percentage point in college attainment in New York State, it would add $17.5 billion in economic activity. We've been talking about wanting to have more resources for schools, more resources for the things that we value. Part of how we get there is to ensure that more of our students graduate from high school ready to succeed in college.
I don't necessarily have the same problems in my school district that other school districts are facing. What I can tell you right now is, if you want to fix education, if you're really truly concerned, you go and fix the impoverished schools. That's what needs to be fixed. That's the reason why we believe as a nation that we're not college and career ready. Because there are hundreds and thousands of children that are college and career ready. Because they get the support and the nurturing that they need from their teachers and their families. Don't fix the problems that are such that those impoverished schools, that's the problem. It's not the rest of it. People are willing to acknowledge that. Nothing is going to be good.
We're going to, thank you very much. I'm going to switch from Common Core at this point to APPR, but I did want to point something out. When we spoke about being college and career ready, Commissioner, there was a reference to community colleges and doing surveys in community colleges, and I would hope that our statistics as to the percentage of our students who are college and career ready aren't being extrapolated off a very small group and surveys that were done in a community college setting, as opposed to the four-year colleges that are much, I believe, much more indicative of the vast and larger population here, certainly in the school districts that we have here on the board today.
It's important to emphasize, though, remediation isn't just a problem of our community colleges. Remediation rates in our four-year colleges, not just in New York, but nationally, are down. Throughout the state, what you hear from colleges is a concern about the readiness of students. If you look at our graduation rates, whether it's at our community colleges or at our four-year colleges, they need to be higher in order for us to have a sustained economy and democracy, not just in New York, but around the country. We've got to do better, and that's not just about our highest needs districts. As a state and as a country, we need to continue, Commissioner, achieve at a higher level.
I appreciate that. I do. And as much as I'm as patriotic as the next guy, and I'm concerned about the nation as a whole, I'm more concerned about New York State, most particularly this area of Nassau County. And when we talk about the schools that are here, these are schools that are sending 97% of their kids out to college. Those 96 and 97% that go on to four-year colleges, of those, 96 and 97% of those kids are graduating in 4 years. So I that we take the opportunity to do what was just suggested, which is, if there are high needs districts, if there are districts that are struggling, if we understand, and we do, that we have limited resources that are available to us, then let's think about allowing our school districts that are high performing and getting it done and have been getting it done historically, have them continue to do the great job that they're doing. Discussion about APPR. If we have time at the end of the forum, we will return because there are some questions that we may be asked. The first question in our APPR discussion comes from Michael Nagler, Dr. Nagler, Superintendent of the Mineola School District. And will be followed by Jay Pildick from Raleigh.
Commissioner, prior to the adoption of the APPR legislation, the state had an acceptable assessment program without the notion of high-stakes tests. Yet as soon as student performance was tied to teacher evaluations, the anxiety level rose exponentially. Why aren't we working collaboratively to fix the APPR regulations? Isn't there an acceptable compromise position? perhaps a 3-year aggregate of student achievement to determine teacher performance level?
The role of student performance, the 20% of the evaluation that's based on student performance, is established in state law. The state law sets that 20% that's based on student performance is based on student progress over the prior year. There are lots of areas of flexibility around the APPR law. As you know, 80% of the evaluation is determined locally through collective bargaining. And for the 80% of teachers who don't teach students in grades 4 through 8 ELA and math, the growth portion is determined locally by school districts. So there is tremendous flexibility, and there are many districts today who are submitting material changes, making adjustments to the evaluation as we move into the second year. But the law requires, I think rightly, that student performance is a portion of the multiple measures evaluation system.
So to follow up that, if we're spending an awful lot of time to put together a score for 20% of our teachers, that's only 20% of their score. And the anxiety level of these exams, right or wrong, it feels a lot more than that. It feels like the basis is 100% of a teacher's evaluation is based on their scores. So how do you mitigate that? How do we, if that's not really the case, how are we getting this message out to say they aren't as high stakes as we think they are, or are they? Because we have 700 different APPRs in the state, which complicates everything.
No question. The APPR law is a local control law that puts much of the decision-making at the local level. You're right about the communications challenge around this. I think there is a general perception that what the APPR does is make the evaluation based on student test scores. In fact, many folks, I think, in the general public think that the APPR makes it based on students' absolute performance on test scores. But in fact, what the law requires is that 20% of the evaluation is based on student growth on assessments over the prior year. So there's communications work to do, no question, at the state level and at the local level to make sure that folks understand that the state tests are a portion of the evaluation, a factor among multiple measures. Similarly for students, to make sure that students and families understand that the assessments are just a part of how the decisions are made about which programs students participate in, whether or not students are promoted from grade to grade, and so forth.
Thank you. Just as a follow-up, as well, since we're discussing state law. If we're discussing evaluations and the interpretation of that law and the implementation of that law, each school district was required to get a sign-off from the state education department with regard to each school district's individual assessment requirements, that 20%. And testing was, by and large, the preferred method of being able to achieve that early and late evaluation of the student growth during that year. Will the state education department show some flexibility in allowing school districts to come up with other metrics, or assist school districts to come up with other metrics that will avoid the need for testing to come up with that section of, or that 20% of the evaluation?
Yeah, to be clear, from the outset, in the 20% that is the state growth portion, for the 20% of teachers who teach in grades 4 through 8 ELA and math, there's a state growth score that is provided based on state assessments. For the other 80% of educators, the process was for the district to work with educators to set goals for student learning and agree on a way to measure student progress towards those goals. Performance-based assessments were and are perfectly acceptable. It could be essays or a series of science experiments. They don't have to be multiple choice tests.
Commissioner, it's my understanding that the flexibility that you're demonstrating and you're describing that the state education department had with respect to this wasn't necessarily reflected in the responses that our school districts got. So what I would ask is, if that isn't in fact the position that you have with respect to other metrics to be used other than testing, that we go back and we follow up on it.
Yep, our guidance on that has been consistent, but we are working with districts even today to make material changes to their plans to allow them to use performance-based assessments in place of other instruments of measurement that they may have chosen.
Thank you. Next up, Kate Pilnick from Roslyn, followed by James O'Hagan, who is the superintendent of the Floral Park Delaware School District.
As a building administrator, my colleagues and I are committed to support our teachers and provide them with meaningful observations. Since the inception of APPR process, we have conducted all of our observations as prescribed by the law and have spent endless hours completing rubrics for each teacher. My question is twofold. If you were evaluated as Commissioner of Education using an approved APPR rubric, knowing that the test scores in New York State declined approximately 30%, what heady rating would you receive? Explain why and provide evidence. Can you provide evidence of how and where Race to the Top money was spent on direct classroom instruction and not on APPR?
So on the first point about the change in the assessment performance, the change in assessment performance reflects, as we have said throughout, a new baseline based on a new set of standards. It is not to say that schools taught less last year or that students learned less last year. The assessments were based on a new baseline of the higher standards of the Common Core. And yes, the proficiency rate on the assessments reflects that higher standard. It also is very consistent with the state's results on the NAEP assessment. It's also very consistent with the percentage of students at the high school level who score on the Regents exams, the level that would predict success in credit-bearing college courses. So the assessments, important to say, the scores were different because there were a new baseline against a new set of standards. In terms of the Race to the Top money, the Race to the Top money was, the constraints on the Race to the Top money were that the majority of the funds, half the funds, were required to go to districts. It's actually in New York, the majority of the funds went directly to districts to support professional development, either through their network teams in districts or network teams regionally through the BOCES. The remainder of the funds largely went to grant programs to districts, some to our lowest performing districts to intervene in their lowest performing schools, some to establish teacher leadership programs. I'm sure there are in this room districts that have the strengthening teacher and leader effectiveness grants, some $75–80 million to support teacher leadership, coaching of colleagues, professional development. A significant portion of the funds will make available the curriculum materials that we've developed together with educators from around the state and will continue to develop. So the resources for Race to the Top, it's not an aid flow, it's designed to be capacity building for districts and for the state.
See, that was 2/3 of my question. So if you go to, and if you need help, I can give you some standards on the Knights of multi-dimensional. So if you gave yourself a score on these very complicated rubrics that we're all working with, every day, what would your score be? What would your score be?
Honest, be honest.
I'm not gonna give a rating. It's not for me to give a rating. What I would say is that
But as the chief administrator, so say you did standard 1 in the Knights, which is knowledge of student learning. Indicator 1A describes plans to use knowledge of development of characters of students. You've heard that from parents and teachers today. How would you rate yourself or your group in scoring that?
It's not for me to give a rating. This work that we're doing on the Common Core and the APPR isn't about one person. It's not about me. It's about students. The question is, how do we ensure that our students are as prepared as possible for college and career success? How do we ensure that all educators are getting continuous feedback on their performance and the opportunity to improve? So it's not about me. It is about our collective.
I know, and that's what we're doing, and we're doing it.
Okay, hold on. But the point is made, and I believe that point that you just made is shared by many of the teachers who share that same frustration. It's about the kids and the performance of the kids. And we have to try and figure out a transition to a better system because it's putting an undue pressure on teachers and the system. Thanks for the question. On deck we have David Symes, teacher with the Swanton School District.
Good afternoon, Commissioner. Thank you very much for attending this evening at this point. It was encouraging to hear you say that we should take control where we can. Looking at a recent Ed Week article, I would just like to offer, in the spirit of trying to make things better, that perhaps this might have some traction for us. For the second time, the U.S. Department of Education is giving states with No Child Left Behind waivers more time to decide whether they would want an extra year to implement a key piece of their teacher evaluation system. First, the deadline to apply for a one-year waiver was September 30th. Then it was moved to October 31st, and now it's November 22nd. This waiver extension allows states to postpone using student growth on state tests as a factor in personnel decisions for up to one additional year until the 2016-17 school year. Originally, the federal waiver guideline required states to do this all by the 15-16 school year. Why then, sir, in light of the opportunity that still exists through the Federal Department of Education, is application for a waiver not under consideration? This would give us time to effectively build capacity for developing a meaningful implementation of this reform and work with our staff in improving instructional practice in a much more collegial manner.
First, the U.S. Department of Education can waive New York State law. So the evaluation system is in New York State law. It's not a matter of U.S. Department of Education regulations or so forth. So state law requires student performance to be one of multiple measures for the evaluation system. I think that's right. And that's the agreement that we made. When we made that agreement, the government, the legislature, NYSEC, the State Education Department, we made it knowing, back in 2010, knowing that we were both simultaneously entering the work on teacher and principal evaluation and the work on the Common Core. I think it's right for student growth to be a part of the evaluation system. Student growth measured by their progress towards the standards in the Common Core, for that to be a part of the evaluation. I don't think state tests should be the sole measure. It's 20% in our state evaluation system. That's based on state test growth for the 20% of teachers in grades 4 through 8 English and math. I think that's right. The US DOE waiver is not directly relevant to New York because our evaluation system is in state law, but more importantly, I think the law that we all agreed to back in 2010 and revised in 2012 got it right to have student performance as a factor. Not the only factor, but one of multiple measures to evaluate performance. And last year, 91% of teachers were rated effective or highly effective. Only 1% teachers were rated in the ineffective category. That further demonstrates the point that we've made throughout, that the evaluation system is not intended to be a gotcha system. It's intended to be a resource for professional development.
If I may, did the race to the top drive the New York State legislation to include teacher performance as part of our ability to secure the grant?
The agenda for Race to the Top was set by the Board of Regents based on what board and department believe can move education forward in the state. The idea of including student performance as a factor among multiple measures for evaluation is independent of Race to the Top. There are many states throughout the country that are engaged in that work that aren't Race to the Top states. The other point I would make, we talked about NAEP results earlier. New York's NAEP results have been flat for some time. Last week, the two places that made the largest gains on NAEP which is a gold standard for comparing performance across states, were Tennessee and the District of Columbia. The thing that the Tennessee and the District of Columbia are ahead of us on is the work on teacher and principal evaluation, and they are also working on the Common Core. DC integrated the Common Core into their assessments just last year. So I believe in the use of student performance as one of multiple measures for the evaluation system. I agree with the statement.
And sir, so do I, but what I would like to just leave you with, after 25 years as a school district leader, what I learned in my first 5 years was that how you did something was just as important as what you did.
David Sines, followed by Brian Hayward from the Fiscal School District.
Commissioner, under the SED mandated APPR system, individual teachers and/or buildings must create an SLO in which they use the best available data on student performance to predict what percentage of their students will achieve a predetermined amount of growth or achieve proficiency on a mandated test. Even with the most accurate data available, the overwhelming number of variables involved in a prediction like this guarantees that that predicted percentage of students is at best still a guess. Teachers and/or buildings are in turn rewarded with an effective or highly effective rating when their guess is accurate. How can you justify rating teachers and educators based on what is effectively their ability to gamble in selecting those percentages?
So the SLOs, which are a portion, to learning objectives, are a portion of the evaluation here. 20% of the evaluation that is required for the state growth portion of the evaluation for the 80% of teachers who are not in grades 4 through 8 ELA and math. When setting the SLO, what the educator and district are doing together is setting a goal for the students. And you would want every educator to start the school year with a goal for students and a plan for measuring their progress towards that goal. Students' progress towards that goal should be a factor among multiple factors used for an evaluation. When the principal observes, the principal makes an assessment, or the assistant principal, or the department chair. They make an assessment of what they see during their observation, but we would, I think, both agree that they observe only a sample of the instruction. And they make an evidence-informed judgment based on the sample of instruction they see in 2 observations or 5 observations, whatever the number. And that, too, is a factor alongside the progress that students made towards the goal. Now, districts have tremendous flexibility in how the SLO process works, how the goals are set, and that's an important thing for districts to revisit now after the first year of the evaluation system. And districts are making adjustments to their goals based on what they learned from the first year of the evaluation system. Again, last year, 91% of teachers were rated effective or highly effective. Districts set goals that by and large were reasonable, but in places where they think that they should adjust those goals, they can and are.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So you teach in what?
I teach high school mathematics at New Hyde Park High School.
So before the APPR, I'm sure that your school went through a rigorous evaluation because we are in the midst of extremely talented school districts with extremely talented teachers, principals, and superintendents. So before this, how was an evaluation done of your teacher, of you as a teacher, or of your teaching cohort?
It was based on a series of observations by our building and district level administration, experienced educators, and by peer evaluations as well over the course of the year. We as educators have always set goals for ourselves. That's not really the issue here. We will continue to do that. It was done by evaluations and observations of our performance in the classroom.
And now 60% of the evaluation really, I think, holds that piece as a holy grail, that it is really up to the school. So it's really about the local 20%. So I'm just wondering.
Please understand, I do agree that the 60% that's based on traditional observations is a vital part of this. I agree with that. Anything that helps an educator in the classroom is absolutely essential, and I give it my full support. It's the fact that you're, as an educator, when you set these percentages, you're making a guess, and then you're getting rewarded on your ability to guess, or you're getting penalized on your ability to not guess correctly at the end. That's 20% of your points as a teacher that comes down to what is a gamble, and it should not be that.
That's not the design of the SLO process, so we certainly can follow up and share some of the technical assistance and professional development resources that we have available around how some objectives are set.
I just want to say one thing very quickly. You've mentioned a number of times about how colleges across the state and the country have claimed, ongoingly have claimed that the education system is not making students college and career ready. I just would hope that you'd be as willing to listen to high school educators and parents in districts across the state as you appear to be willing to listen to the people in the colleges that are telling you this.
One of the recurring points that I heard as I kind of traveled around my district and met with stakeholders in this issue is that we have always had evaluations in our schools. As a parent, I know intuitively, for example, which teacher I would like my daughter to have. We know, and the process has had some fabulous results, especially Chancellor, as you mentioned, in the area where we are here. They've got this done. Teachers are doing their jobs. Superintendents and principals are evaluating teachers. Teachers are evaluating teachers, and they've told me to a person that not only are the teachers evaluating their peers, but the administrators have historically evaluated, and if there are teachers that are not performing to standards, there's a way of getting them and removing them from that school district. So that is the historic model that has existed here before this was placed as an overlay and as an requirement. Has there been any thought to school districts that do have high-achieving, high-performing districts, giving them the opportunity to continue with their historic rubric in terms of evaluation, because performance and measures demonstrate that it's working, and again, focus resources on those districts that are most needy, that do show the most need for attention, and dedicate resources and focus the SED's attention on those districts that need it most.
In many ways, the law was structured with that in mind by creating for 20% of the teachers, 80% of the evaluation is locally determined. The only additional new factor, because of the APPR law, is the student performance, student growth. And for the other 80%, the other 80% of teachers, all of the decisions are made locally. So there is tremendous flexibility. If a district was doing observations with a rubric before, if a district was doing peer observations before, if a district was doing setting goals and had assessments that they were using to assess progress towards those goals, the APPR didn't require them to do something new. It required them to describe that for the plan that was approved by the department. Now, what districts had in place beforehand certainly ranged.
Commissioner, I'll just leave it at this, and we will move on to other questions. Everything we do has to be based on one fundamental question. How does it improve the educational quality, or the quality of education of our child? And when we talk about that, if the child in a district is receiving a high-quality education, performing exceptionally by all metrics that exist out there, and now we have an evaluation system that doesn't add anything to the quality of education that that child receives, is there not an opportunity to reevaluate it, especially when you consider the fact that every one of these school districts is spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in the evaluation system at a time when they're having
The related question is, if people were already doing all the elements of the evaluation system, then it isn't a new set of activities and a new burden and a new cost. It's what they were doing already. I will say, statewide superintendent's organization did a survey of superintendents statewide. And one of the things that came out of that survey was a consistent theme that more conversations are happening across the state about instructional practice, that administrators and teachers are having more conversations about instructional practice, that the number and the quality of observations and feedback conversations has improved and increased as a result of the work on APPR. And people may have different views about the student performance component, but the clear evidence statewide is that the work on teacher and principal evaluation has fostered more productive conversations about instructional practice.
What I would suggest, I'm going to move on and I will be quiet from now on. I will suggest this. When we, here's my point, and I do want to let Mr. Hayward go with this question. I would suggest, if you have the opportunity, when you visit schools, don't announce that you're coming. Show up. You can get you're seeing the best and the brightest in that school, prepared to have the commissioner come visit. Visit a school, walk into the door, see what it's like when they don't know you're coming, and let's see what kind of results we get.
With the ever-increasing use of technology in the classroom, is there any consideration being given to computerized assessments such as the NWEA Measures of Academic Progress, which is aligned with the Common Core standards, being used for teacher and principal state growth scores in lieu of state assessments in ELA and mathematics grades 3 through 8?
Those assessments, that, like the math assessment, can be used for the locally selected portion. They can be used for the state portion for teachers in grades that don't have state tests. When the grades and subjects where there are state tests, the state tests have to be used for the state 20% of the evaluation. In the long run, we do expect the state tests to move online, similar to the NWEA. We are participating in a consortium of states that's working to develop assessments that would be administered online. At some point, the Board of Regents will make a decision about whether or not to adopt those assessments, but I think it's clear, you can see this throughout the state, it's clear that in the long run, technology will play a larger role in instruction, and ultimately, assessments will be delivered online through paper or pencil. In the long run, and there's work to do to get there.
Thank you. Next question is by Deborah Anderson, Brooklyn parent in Fort Washington School District.
Forgot to call me up on deck. Sorry. Thank you very much for hosting this forum and for moderating, and also to Mineola High School. New York State raced to the top. Now we are faced with the looming issue of race to the top unfunded mandates. Only 1 year ago, Dr. Kenneth Mitchell, working with the Center for Research, Regional Education and Outreach at SUNY New Paltz, put together a comprehensive study entitled, I quote, "Federal Mandates on Local Education, Costs and Consequences. Yes, it's a race, but is it in the right direction?" Close quotes. For those of you unfamiliar with Dr. Mitchell, he is an educator with an impeccable and impressive resume of over 35 years of experience in education. He is the current district superintendent of the South Orangetown School District and newly elected president of the formidable Lower Hudson Council of School Superintendents, a consortium of 76 school districts and 4 BOCES, with an increasingly forceful voice for public education in New York State. Dr. Mitchell has spent considerable time studying unfunded mandates. Although this study does not include Long Island, it is nevertheless highly informative and instructive. Distilled to its essence, Dr. Mitchell's study shows that the total cost to implement Race to the Top mandates far exceed the grant funding. In Rockland County, for example, leaders projected a total 4-year cost of almost $11 million. Compare that to the aggregate revenue of about $400,000 received in Race to the Top grant money. That's a projected $10 million deficit for Rockland County alone. Dr. Mitchell states, there are serious challenges to this federal program's validity and the research upon which it is based. Without substantive validation, New York State and U.S. taxpayers are funding a grand and costly experiment that has the potential to take the public education in the wrong direction at a time when we need to be more competitive than ever before. Much is being sacrificed to meet this expensive mandate. My question is in 2 parts. First, New York State received $700 million in grant money pursuant to Race to the Top. How much money in unfunded mandates has New York State already spent to implement Race to the Top, including, but not limited to, all costs associated with implementing the new APPR, including costs associated with the first year's implementation, i.e. the Section 3012C training certification for supervisors, man hours to complete paperwork and technology improvements, all costs associated with implementing the Common Core, including training, curriculum development, materials, testing, etc., all costs associated with upgrading or installing new technology, including technology for new assessments and new data systems, costs for professional development and miscellaneous costs, and what entities and corporations are benefiting from these payments. That's the first part of my question.
So it's important to say about Race to the Top that Race to the Top was not designed to be an aid funding stream. It was designed to be capacity building. And it was designed to mobilize the redirection of existing resources. The Common Core, for example, implementing the Common Core should be reflected in the professional development dollars that are being expended independent of Race to the Top. We've spent literally billions of dollars in federal and state funds alone, not counting local dollars, on professional development since the Common Core standards were adopted in 2010. The adoption of the Common Core is not additive. It's about redirecting those professional development dollars to support the successful implementation of the standards to ensure that students are prepared for college and career success. Similarly, around the evaluation system, 40-some states are engaged in this work of changing teacher and principal evaluation. Only a small number have Race to the Top funds to even support that work. That work is the right work. The gains that Tennessee and DC demonstrated just last week helped to confirm that that's the right work. So the evaluation investment, again, is about repurposing investments. Now, if the district decided that they wanted to purchase technology to administer a locally selected measure like the NWA that was mentioned by the previous questioner, that's a district decision about instruction and technology tools independent of the APPR. The APPR doesn't require districts to give computer-based assessment. The APPR didn't require districts to invest in new technology tools. If districts invested in technology tools to allow principals to do their observations on an iPad and aggregate the information from their observations, that's an expenditure independent of APPR. We just talked about at some length that districts were doing observations, not all, but many, were doing observations before the APPR law.
If the money is being simply rechanneled to other areas, and you're saying it's dollar for dollar, so then when I go to my school budget meeting next month, I'm not going to have to worry about them cutting arts and music and extracurricular activities learning and enrichment and all of the things that they've grappled with before, because they're not going to be in the hole, because there aren't going to be any other mandates that they're going to have to fund. Is that what you're telling us?
There are a variety of things that districts have to fund. I'm not at all saying that districts aren't facing very significant, difficult financial choices. Some because of constraints on local spending, some because of constraints on state spending, all of which reflect the economic climate that we're in. So there's no question that districts are struggling with those kinds of resource decisions. But the Common Core and the APPR, those are investments that should be the focus of professional development dollars that ought to be expended in districts. There's a huge amount of professional development money that's provided to districts through Title I, through Title IIA. There's resources that are provided to districts through textbook aid and software aid. And so aligning those expenditures with higher standards, that's not about new spending. That's about aligning those existing funding streams. But I don't want to pretend for a second that districts aren't facing tough financial decisions and will continue to, particularly as we see many districts around the state with significant declining enrollment, exacerbates those fiscal challenges.
So our districts are not going to see any increased property taxes or any increased spending or any type of constraints or drama as because of race to the top. We're all great, which is why New York State ran to $700 million, because we didn't need any more money to implement what we already have.
It's about using the $700 million to ensure that the investments we're making are the most sensible ones. For example, SUNY last year spent some $70 million on remedial courses. That $70 million would be much better spent on providing students with, at the higher education level, more opportunities. Part of how we get there is to reduce the need for remediation by raising our standards in K-12. So that it's all the only point I make is that the expenditures are interrelated, and that the $700 million was not intended to replace the $57 billion that we spend as a state. It was intended to build capacity, and yes, there were adjustments in how that $57 billion is spent, how money is spent on professional development, how time is allocated. It should reflect the work on the Common Core.
Except that states are being forced to change course because these are mandates. So we don't really have a choice. So then when we have to divert our money to the mandates, something else is going to have to give, because there's only so much I can give.
There is federal money that comes attached with significant strings. And when there are decisions made on a state level that accepts that money, unfortunately, oftentimes it comes without a true understanding of what those strings mean at the local level. And that's a truism. I asked recently, what would it take for New York State to tell the federal government to take all of these requirements and to keep them? And the number that I was given, and Commissioner, correct me of course if I'm wrong, is that New York State receives approximately $2 billion a year in funding from the federal government in one way, shape, or form that is tied to the state's requirements. And if we were to give up $2 billion, which we accepted to begin with, where would we get that $2 billion? So there's a more, I think, critical question that we have to, as policymakers, come to grips with. That is, yes, oftentimes it's easy to accept money. We have to have a better understanding, one, of how are we going to extricate ourselves from these requirements once we fully understand what the impact is at a local level. And sure.
How do we fight the race to the top? It was very clear to us that the federal government was headed in a direction of the implementation of Common Core standards nationally. We had a choice. 45 states are now implementing Common Core. We could either apply for the grant to help us build capacity to implement Common Core, or we could be only 11 states got money to implement Common Core. Was it 11? 12. Sorry, I'm sorry, it was 12. The rest are just doing it on their own dime. They still have to do it because the federal government has tied loads of other grants to the implementation of what we actually accepted money to do. I'm a very practical person. I understand the idea of a federal mandate, and I understand that this was coming down fast and furious and in a very direct way. Our choice was to either get the $700 million to help build capacity, or to be like the other states who didn't get a dime to help build capacity. They still have to do it, but we got some aid to do it.
Socialized education.
Well,
Just the way it
I appreciate the question. We are now halfway through our 4 sections that we had originally set up to discuss this evening. We're also a little over 40 minutes away from completion. So we're going to go through 2 sections, one being assessments and the concept and discussion that's out there involving opt-out, what the considerations are for not only testing but the consequences of opting out, which I think is critically important. And then we'll segue into the privacy issue that I know is critically important to all of our parents when it comes to information or disinformation that may exist with regard to privacy and privacy concerns. The first question is from Bridget McCormick from Mineola, followed by Lori Beth Schwartz from Great Neck.
The adaptation of the Common Core has led to a change in the NISA, the alternate assessment, given to our most disabled students. These students have IEP goals that include things like shifting their eye gaze when their name is called. However, the tasks they are evaluated on as part of the new NISA requirements are things like multiplication and division. The assessment is clearly not appropriate for these students' ability and takes valuable time away from the schoolwork that is meaningful to their lives. I wanted to know if you visited schools like Nassau, BOCES, Common Roads, which is one of the most amazing schools on Long Island here, and Gino was one of the people that spoke earlier. To what extent were professionals that actually work with these students consulted in the development of these tests? And I've heard you say a couple of times that educators have been a part of this. I'm wondering if it's people that went to school to be teachers, or if it's people that are actually teaching these students. If the new emphasis on testing excludes us from using common sense when it comes to addressing the needs of this particular population, because it really feels like the testing is giving us more information about what these kids can't do instead of what they can do. And as a CSE chairperson, I can tell you that I sit in rooms with these parents every year, and they trust me, and they trust my district, and they trust the state to make good decisions for them. And when we are just highlighting over and over again what their kids can't do, it's hurtful.
So I think there's a need for more conversation than we have time for here. I'm happy to arrange, work with the center of staff, get in touch with you to arrange a conversation with our special ed team, our assessment team, and the regional special ed technical assistance provider. The intent of the changes to the NISA were in response to the requests from educators around the state to include tasks in the NISA that allowed us to identify a wider range of skills than was possible with the prior NISA, which we both agree did not cover the range of skills that exist within that 1%. It was not intended to have students asked to do things that they are not capable of doing because of their disabilities. So we should have more conversation about it. The NISA implementation has just begun. I think there are clearly places where we need to provide more clarity in our guidance. So I would encourage you, if you can arrange with the center staff, we can certainly have that conversation. The way the NISA is structured, as you know, is to have a range of tasks that could represent a given standard based on the student's needs, their IEP goals, their disability, and the changes to the NYSA, again, were not intended to ask students who are facing significant cognitive challenges, for example, within that 1%, to do things that they're not capable of doing. But as you know, within that 1%, again, are students who can do more than was asked on the old NYSA, which did not give us them or their families or their teachers information about what they could do. And so the challenge is getting the right balance. We may be able to improve our guidance on NYSA implementation and happy to work with you on that.
You know, obviously the criteria to be eligible for the NYSA is, you know, severe cognitive delays, severe physical delays. You know, we're talking about students, like I said, the goal really is shift eye gaze when their name is called. And the tasks, and I went to the training, you know, I did all this, the tasks clearly are, can a child multiply and divide? So it really does seem like there is a huge disconnect. So I really do wonder how much educators that really work with these kids were involved in the creation of that.
Again, teachers are involved in the test development process. But again, I'm happy to spend more time on this. We want to get the NYSA right. It is worth saying, though, that there were throughout the state educators who asked us to include more challenging tasks within the NYSA, because within that 1% were students who could do more than was captured by the existing NYSA. But we should spend more time on that.
My understanding is then that they shouldn't be taking the NYSA. They should be taking the regular assessments and everybody else is taking it or able to do that.
But as we talked about, that's the challenge, right? That the gap between the 1% and the standards of the general education assessment is quite wide. And so that's the reason we are trying to work with the U.S. Department of Education on thinking about whether there should be another 2% that has a different kind of assessment. But the percentages themselves are difficult lines to draw from what students are capable, as you know. So we should just, we're happy to spend more time on it.
And that's a whole other discussion, is the kids that are lost in between. Because there's the kids that are taking NYSA,
We have a commitment to the commissioner, that we're going to work to get the standards right for special needs children, and we'll follow up on that. Thank you. Followed by Dr. Kathleen Mooney from the Port Washington School District.
Just on a personal note, I do have a son who has an IEP, and where numbers were his friends this year, there's a significant change in all of the writing and paragraphs and things that he has to do now are actually making it very difficult for him to do the math that last year it came a lot easier for him. But anyway, my question is, exactly how and when are you planning to change the Regents exam to align with the Common Core? And based upon the confusion and the uproar that was created by the scores and the new tests last year, and the level of outcry for significant adjustment to the test and tweaking, how can the parents of the very first grade to take a new Regents exam actually prepare them for it? How long do you give them to prepare for that?
So, appreciate the question. So, Regents exam, the phase-in of the new Regents exams begins with the students who started 9th grade this year. Those students will take the Common Core algebra exam at the end of this year. Students will also be able to take, and this is very similar to the transition that the state previously made from math A and B to the current assessment system, 2005 standards. Students this year will also be able to take the old algebra exam, the algebra exam based on the 2005 standards, and use the higher score for the purposes of meeting the graduation requirements. Next year, there will be a geometry Common Core Regents exam. The following year, the Algebra 2 Common Core Regents exam. We will begin offering the English Language Arts Common Core Regents exam this year. for students that want to opt to take that, as we continue to administer the existing English Language Arts Regents exam. That class of 2017 will be the first class required to pass the Common Core English Language Arts exam. It's important to say that with the Regents exams, we already had the distinction between passing at a basic level of performance and a score level that would indicate college and career readiness. Regents adopted back in 2010 the standard that students pass at a 65, but at a 75 in English Language Arts and 80 in math, you can see a greater likelihood that the students will enroll in and succeed in credit-bearing college courses. So in many ways, on the 3rd through 8th grade exams, the 1, 2, 3, 4 scale, the 3 on the 3rd through 8th grade exams is much more like the 75, 80 level on the existing Regents exam. And the 2 much more like the 65. Partial command of the standards, but not sufficient to move on to the next level of coursework without additional support. So the board has talked about and will continue to discuss how we maintain that kind of standard. So we don't expect the pass grades for the Regents exam, the graduation rates, to be impacted initially by the transition to the Common Core. Now, over the long term, for the students, let's say, who were in 3rd grade last year, there is a question that the board will need to consider. When do we raise the standard for passing the Regents exam to say that passing the Regents exam is a good predictor of students' ability to succeed in a credit-bearing college course? And, in a sense, raise the way that the department did in the past, raise the standard from 55 to 65. Is there a point where we would raise the standard from 65 to 75? Would we do that with students who are current, let's say, who were 3rd graders last year, as they move towards high school graduation in 2022? But that's a question that the board has not yet addressed. So in the short run, the passing threshold for the Regents exam will be similar to the current passing threshold.
Thank you very much. Dr. Mooney will be followed by Charles Leone from Manhasset.
Thank you for the opportunity to dialogue about these important issues. Are there any conversations at the state ed level concerning the possibility of differentiated assessments? If not, what is the purpose in differentiating instruction if we're not differentiating assessments? If there have been some conversations, would this be something that could be considered for all students or students with disabilities?
Very thoughtful question. So there are at least 3 ways to differentiate assessments, one of which we do now, which is that on the assessments by design, there are a range of questions that capture a range of skill levels. So you can dominantly get an assessment, more challenging questions, less challenging questions, so you can get a range of, you can capture a range of performance on the assessment. With paper pencil assessments, it's very difficult to have differentiated assessments beyond that sort of conclusion of a range. One of the promises of online assessment and future online assessment is that you might be able to have, what we would call adaptive assessments that offer questions that are different difficulty levels based on how the student performs. But really, you need online assessment to make that possible. In the long run, I expect over time, many of the assessments that we give, both at the state level and in schools, will start to reflect that sort of adaptive capacity, which will also mean when you get to online assessments, that students can take the test when they're ready. And so maybe students will take the Regents exam in March instead of in June, that kind of thing. But that's in the long run, it will require us to build technology capacity. The third level of differentiation is around students with disabilities, and it goes to the conversation we had about the 1% and the 2%. The federal government requires that you have a maximum of 1% of students taking the alternate assessment. There's a long-standing federal rule which never used in New York that allowed another 2% of students to take what's called a modified assessment. Actually, the feds are in the process of eliminating the modified assessment for the states that are using it based on the advocacy of the Students with Disabilities Rights community, concerned that the 2% in many states was causing students not to have access to the general curriculum. But what we've discussed, the board discussed, is the possibility of asking the U.S. Department of Education, with the governance discussion, about whether for that 2% in New York, we could have students take the test at their instructional level rather than at their chronological age. So a student is instructionally based on their IEP at third grade, even though the age of the fifth grade would be able to take the third grade assessment. But the concern the USDOE has expressed, and I think will continue to express, is a worry that that will then result in some students getting less quality instruction than they need because the expectations will be set too low. And that's the thing we've got to work through with the U.S. Department of Education.
I can tell you, as I've done my career as a special education teacher and a director of pupil personnel services, I've overseen special education programs in a couple of districts here on Long Island, and I can speak to the very high quality of instruction that has always occurred that I have witnessed. I do have one follow-up question.
You should know we are lobbying on the other side of this issue very heavily by people who represent communities of disabilities. So I am sure the federal government is being lobbied very heavily not to allow us this waiver. Nonetheless, we're going to push forward because we think it's the right thing to do for all the reasons you laid out so articulately. Thank you.
I just have one follow-up question. Are there any possibilities of reducing testing to every other year? We understand that the ELA and the math exams are required under the No Child Left Behind, but are state commissioners of education pleading with the U.S. Department of Education to maybe consider these kinds of changes?
Madam, I would just say to you, John, I didn't mean to step in front of you, but it is a huge frustration to watch the federal government work. Their inability to articulate a revision of ESEA over this last decade, it's a decade now, has really caused what I think an inability to articulate some of these issues in the right form. If we could get to a place where the federal government could actually get beyond itself to articulate a reauthorization of this law, so many of these issues would be brought to the fore. Until then, we are working our way through trying to find a creative use of waivers to bring those issues which we think will get a fair hearing.
Thank you. Followed by Eileen Mazarowski, a parent from the Carl's Place School District.
Good evening. It is evening now. I just wanted to say thank you for being here and for answering all these questions and providing us. A perfect segue from the last speaker was the fact that we're really asking for some leadership on this. And what I'd like to say is that in a letter that you wrote, I think it was in early October, you said there were approximately 64,800 minutes in a typical school day, and that each year a maximum of 540 of those minutes were devoted to state tests in 3 through 8 in ELA and mathematics, less than 1% of the school year. And it's what we do with the other 64,000 minutes that will determine how successful our students are. And indeed, we agree with you. We think many of our school districts here throughout Long Island and New York State do use the 64,000 minutes in the classroom in, shall I say, a highly effective manner, and resulting in school districts that are high-performing or gap closing. And we continue to be subjected to the constraints of the one-size-fits-all model imposed by the State Education Department and other constraints. This doesn't seem fair to students. My question really is, what is preventing the Board of Regents and the State Education Department from recognizing that these school districts have done yeoman service, continuing with high-performing and gap-closing work, and championing their good efforts by releasing them from the strict constraints of the one-size-fits-all model? just because this ties into something you said earlier. In previous forums and again tonight, you said we put the onus on the federal government. We're talking about waivers and hoping for those to come through. But the crux of this is we're respectfully asking you, Chancellor Tisch, Commissioner, to take the leadership on this, even to the federal level, and say, this is what our districts are asking for. Can we have another round?
I just want to say, I share your frustration. For 5 years now, we've been talking across this state about creating a pathway to graduation for our high school students that we would call multiple pathways, right? And we've had proposals, and your superintendents, and I see some of them sitting out here, can tell you that we articulated a vision that would allow students to just simply meet the federal requirements of math, English, and science exam mandated by the federal government, and then to create an articulated view of high school graduation which allowed students to be a STEM scholar or an art scholar or a CTE pathway scholar. Each of these has met with enormous resistance across this state by disparate groups who, for reasons that are not truly understandable to me, have gone out of their way to cut off that conversation. Sir, I couldn't agree with you more. The state of New York is a state of enormous talent and enormous capacity. We could create a multiple pathway to graduation for our students, but we need cooperation in the field to help us articulate this in a way that shows deep resonance across communities that they are hungry for this and that they indeed want this. John may have another answer, and I think we should hear from John, but I just wanted to get it out there, because it's been on my mind.
I think that's right about multiple pathways. I also think we are committed to continuing to work with districts to identify places where there is local flexibility. Sometimes the people don't realize that they have. One of the key elements of the APPR is that there are a lot of local decisions. Now, we're trying to work with districts to reflect that the local decisions that they made and where they want to adjust curriculum. It's locally determined. Our providing curriculum resource is not intended to substitute for local judgment about curriculum. We've talked about ways to have flexibility about how time is allocated to school buildings. We've got a grant that's supporting districts in doing shared advanced placement courses across districts in creative ways leveraging technology. So we're committed to that work of trying to identify paths of flexibility, not least of which is the multiple pathways point that we
I'm just curious, in this auditorium, is there anyone sitting here who would be opposed to a multiple pathway to graduation for our students? Then I urge you, actually so much of our time is spent on talking about things that I clearly know are on your mind. But there are so many paths of commonality of effort that we could have. I would urge you over the next number of weeks to pay attention to what's going on in Albany at our Regents meetings about these multiple pathways and join with us to help effectuate these changes in our state.
Okay, we're going to move on because we do have further questions. Next person, Eileen Mazeroski, Carl Place School District, will be followed by Eileen Sanchez from the Elmont School District.
I am a parent and a teacher in the Carl Place School District. Last spring, our district was awarded the Commissioner School Dissemination Grant. Within our grant application, we discussed our use of data, how we use it to inform and drive instruction. In past years, we have used data from the state assessments in a very meaningful way. Each teacher worked closely at looking at patterns and gaps in our students' performance. We worked extensively to identify areas of need and address them as we saw fit. However, in the last 2 years, a pivotal point of instructional change, the lack of data caused a significant void in our decisions regarding our students' needs and guiding changes to our instructional practices. Now we take hours of our school days and weeks to make our students sit for assessments that we are told assess what we've taught. But who knows? We aren't allowed to see them, or if we are involved in the scoring process and see the actual test, we have to sign a release that we will not discuss them in any way, shape, or form. We gain no insight into which standards are actually being assessed or how the tests are assessing them. We don't know if there are any gaps within a standard or domain because we never get to correlate data to the actual test questions. When you even release the annotated test questions for ELA and math this summer, you purposely blocked out the test questions so we couldn't even match that up to any item analysis or gap reports we might have. Pearson is being paid a lot of money. They should be able to create an assessment that measures what a child knows and provide teachers with a valuable, usable data. And right now, as a parent and educator, I feel you're failing at both. You have said that Pearson is building a bank of reliable questions, but with Park around the corner, I don't see how that is necessary. What are you doing to make the information gained from these tests meaningful for teachers?
You should follow up through the Senator's staff. Item analysis at the standard level and the domain or cluster level is available for the assessment. Item analysis linked to the 25% of items that are released is available. And item analysis for the 25% at the student level is available. So we should follow up after this to make sure that you have access to that. The RICs can make that available to districts and the data center. Now, on the question of 25%, I will say some states release no item. Some states release 10%, 20%, 40%. Some states release items every other year or every 2 or 3 years. So a 25% release of items is not unusual among states. If we release more items, I mentioned earlier, if we release more items, we're looking to field test more items, and we're trying to manage and train the amount of time that goes for field testing. We will make a budget proposal. We expect to make a budget proposal that would allow us to do what other states do. We'll explain this a little bit. In New York, we print the tests ourselves at the department. We print 4 forms of the test. Other states print 20 forms, 25 forms, 30 forms. By printing that number of forms, they can embed a small number of field test questions in every form and generate a much larger bank that we can't in New York because we print only 4 forms. We will make a budget request to change that printing structure, which will allow us to print more forms, which will reduce the amount of field testing we have to do and help us over the long run to be able to release a larger percentage of items. But that will require restructuring how the exams are printed. But we should make sure to follow up on the item analysis that is available.
But by doing that, the test now becomes a teaching resource, not only for the teacher, but more importantly for the students, so that the school district and the teacher can determine in what areas perhaps there's some consistent success or lack of success, so they can refocus their attention on those items going forward. It becomes a resource for the school. And in addition to any potential costs for field testing, at its base, an exam is also supposed to be a teaching tool that allows evaluation for teachers and kids.
Agreed. And just to be clear, the fact whether students did well on the addition of fractions questions is something that is available. That item analysis is available. And examples of addition of fractions questions are available.
But if you have 4 questions, let's say addressing central message, and we score well above the region on 2 of them, and well below the region on the other 2, we don't see the questions. What does that tell us?
So again,
it's useless.
Well, no, I wouldn't say knowing that students struggled on the addition of fractions problem is useless, particularly when you have sample addition of fractions questions and some of the questions from the test. But I take your point. You would like to see us release a larger percentage of items.
So would I.
We're trying to balance that with the amount of field testing. And we're going to have a budget proposal that will help to get there.
Thank you. minutes, half an hour this evening if we needed to go over? I appreciate it, because I do have 2 or 3 more questions, but then we need to get into the privacy issue as well.
Is that time?
It's 6:20.
Oh, 6:20. Oh, yeah, half hour, that's fine.
I appreciate it. Eileen Cantor from Elmont, who will be followed by Daniela Manco from the Hicksville Public Schools.
Good evening. It is impossible to overestimate the importance of our discussion here tonight regarding our children's future and education. So I want to thank everyone who's here. In some Long Island districts, campaigns by both parent groups and district administrators are encouraging parents to opt out of state assessments. What specifically are the ramifications if students do not take the test? And what advice would you give to a parent who is considering opting out for their own child?
So I would urge folks to participate in the state assessment. There's, I believe, and this relates to the last question, useful information at the school, district, state level that is generated by state assessments, and they are part of the academic program in the school. There's no provision for opting out because you can't, just as you can't opt out of biology class. You can't opt out of the state assessments. They're part of the academic program of the school. In terms of consequences, the federal government has a participation threshold for student participation in assessment. Schools that fail to meet that participation threshold move into accountability status and have to develop accountability frameworks and so forth. There are particular grant programs like the dissemination grant program that was just mentioned, where the district might lose out on the ability to receive those grant funds. But ultimately, what matters most is that the assessment is an important part of the academic program, a moment in time to measure student progress towards the goal that we all have of college and career readiness.
We certainly understand that, but you certainly are getting tremendous amounts of information letting you know how more than unpalatable these test concessions are for many of our students, and parents are taking these actions to protect their own children from those. Can you be more specific about the kinds of grant monies that, and as far as dollar costs to specific districts? Does that impact more on a district that's less wealthy, for example, than a district that does not rely on those monies?
That would be hard to answer with a specific number. The example of that dissemination grant that was just described is a good illustration of the kind of grant that will be available to a district that is in accountability status. There are also a set of activities that the district has to engage in when they're in accountability status because they don't have participation. It's hard to put a dollar amount on the cost of those accountability activities that would be required. But I think it's less about the question of consequences and more about the value of a part of the core academic program, which is important, provides important information again at families, to classroom, at the classroom level, at the school level.
Right, I understand that, and I certainly have been very much involved in administering these tests during my professional career. What concerns me the most, though, perhaps, is when you grade state tests on a curve. Third graders don't really understand that concept. They just understand how coming out of that test made them feel.
Good evening, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm a parent of fifth grade twins in Fiscal Public Schools. As we know, there is much controversy about the Common Core state test. How are we, the parents, supposed to encourage our children to do well and stay positive about school when they know other classmates have parents writing petitions on social networks against the state testing? In fact, some of those parents are choosing not to have the test administered to their child at all. What message are we to give our children when they know some of their classmates will not have to take the test because of their parents' decision?
I think at the end of the day, the message to students about the test has to be this is a moment in time to give, for you to do something that makes it challenging, that will help provide information for your teacher and your family, that will help them to support me as a learner. And that's ultimately what the tests are for, and that's as true for the spelling quiz or the unit exam in the 7th grade history course as it is for the state assessment. All assessments should be viewed as a moment of time to get information that will help inform instruction. And the other thing I would say is that, and this relates to the last question as well, is that the tests were more challenging. And I think part of the question for the state and the country around the Common Core is the tests are more challenging. Standards are more challenging. But better that we should have students face those challenges while they're in school and surrounded by their teachers and their families that can support them in improving their skills than to have students arrive at college and find that they are required to take remedial courses and then many of those students are required to take remedial courses don't finish, or arrive at the workforce unable to participate. Better to know at the 5th grade level that there's work to do to get better at fractions, and that we can do all of that work together. At the Mineola Middle School today, unrelated to state tests, we were talking about students' participation in a differentiated reading program, and students were perfectly happy and excited about that differentiated reading program and getting information about where they could do more and what else they needed to know so that they could get better. And that's as true of academics as it is of learning instruments or
The problem, I think, in this question revolves around rumors that sometimes crop up about school districts losing funding, consequences to school, Title I monies, other types of monies that are going to schools, and the impact to the school district for an organized opt-out for taking these assessments. Parents are going to do what they want to do, and they're going to do what's best for their child. And if that is and if that is keeping a child home, that's what they're going to do. But I believe this question, the previous question, is what are the consequences to the school district, what's at stake, and beyond fairness, what are the rules? What's the lay of the land? Because there is a lot of information out there, and there is a consensus out there. Again, parents are going to do what they want to do, but there is a sense out there that there is no consequence, and regardless, nothing's going to happen to the school district. Is that true?
No. If the school district doesn't meet the participation requirements in federal law, then the school can be identified as being an accountability status and then have to have an improvement plan and a variety of activities because it's an accountability status. And the district's ability to apply for certain grants is affected, and there are activities they will have to engage in that may have costs associated with them. So, no, it's not true that there are no consequences, but that's not the reason for that decision to be made. I would argue that there is value in the information that the assessment provides, that people should be happy to have that information, and that's the basis for the decision.
And again, Commissioner, and thank you very much. Essentially, a parent's going to do what's best, if that's what it comes down to. The consequences can also be clear. And we can't argue with a parent doing what's best for a child. We just can't. We concluded our third portion of this evening's discussion, and we left the last portion of tonight's discussion for privacy issues. I know there are a lot of concerns that certainly have been voiced with regard to the availability of data, the aggregation of data, the use of and storage of that data on cloud, and the requirements that our schools are being forced to provide certain information. And there may be a lot of misinformation out there as well. Let's try and clarify some of those issues. And as I said earlier, again, in my own life, I tell my kids to watch out what they put online because it's there forever. Nobody can tell me it's going to be destroyed. Nobody says that they can guarantee no one's going to get their hands on it. No one's going to tell me that it's not going to show up at some point because it's out there. And once it's out there, we can't see it, we can't control it, and we can't put our hands on it. So, that being said, We have a number of questions. The first question from Colleen Leon. Colleen. Followed by Andrea Bergen from the Park Place School District.
Oh, Andrea.
Colleen. Which school district?
Oh, Manhasset.
From Manhasset. Thank you.
Good evening. It has been stated in the Engage NY FAQ, even if a district is not participating in Race to the Top and has not selected a dashboard, student data will be part of the data set that is provided to In Bloom by SED. With data security and confidentiality being great concern for districts as well as parents and community members, once a district's data has been submitted through level 1, which is mandated, and therefore released to In Bloom, who and what vendors will have access to student data? Will district student data and assessment scores be used for research purposes and the development of educational apps, ultimately for the gain of In Bloom or their profit?
In Bloom is a nonprofit, so it's not an entity that will make a profit. Second, the only use of data that is allowed is data that is being used to provide a service to a district that's contracted for by that district. Now, aggregate data will be available through the portal, so a district will be able to, for example, see the performance of its students relative to the performance of other students in neighboring districts at the aggregate level, not with students' names and their specific information. The only access to the data at the individual level would be if the district was using the portal. One exception to that, one of the benefits of In Bloom and a process where data can be shared through the state's data collection, which pre-existed in Bloom, as you know, is that if for a highly mobile student, when they move between districts, we would be able to transition their records electronically. Secure electronic transmission.
I just have a question now. We are a district that is not participating in Race to the Top, and we are not participating in the In Bloom data portal, so why are you sending our data to In Bloom?
Right. Again, the only data that they'll have that will be used would be data that is in the aggregate, so that districts that are participating in their data portal and their teacher portal will be able to see aggregate information. That's information that the state has long collected, long provided through a variety of venues. This would be similar to that. It's also worth saying that states and districts all use multiple third-party providers in addition to In Bloom. The vast majority of which are for-profit entities, not nonprofits like In Bloom. In Bloom's data security requirements are also quite high, including that all of the data is encrypted when it's stored within Bloom. It's encrypted when it's transitioned between In Bloom and any of the portal providers. We're very committed to data security. The greatest risks to data security are frequently people who have the same password for multiple services, the use of obvious passwords for multiple services, a laptop left unattended. Those are the greatest security risks. The encryption protocol that In Bloom will follow is a very high degree of security around student data. We are committed to protecting student data privacy. It's also worth saying, and I mentioned this earlier, data that's stored by In Bloom can't be sold to any other third party, can't be given to any other third party for any purpose. The data can only be used by a service that's for the purposes of a service that the district is contracted.
Would you consider allowing the districts to choose which data files they submit to In Bloom versus the mandated data files they must submit to SED? That would allow the discretion to remain at the district level and perhaps make districts a bit more comfortable to what data they are releasing.
The data that would go to In Bloom are a fairly narrow subset of the data that are collected by the department. The department collects a wide variety of data sets as a result of a variety of federal and state requirements and law and regulation. All of that data doesn't go into a data that goes into a data that has a useful instructional purpose within the portal that's being provided. And for a district that, again, for a district that's not using the portal, it's their aggregate information that would be available. And that's information that we provide through any number of means. Aggregate data at the district level is something we report periodically and have for a long time.
One of these sessions on the beginning of this week asked me an interesting question on the way out, and I forgot to add. Ken, you're here. Ken, raise your hand. He's our in-blue guy. So. He's the person at the department who understands in-blue.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have an interesting question. One of the parents asked on the way out of the session at the beginning of this week, what day is today? Wednesday? Monday? Tuesday? Tuesday. Yesterday. Since we have a student identifier for every student in the state now, would it be possible to scrub students' names and addresses from the data files? Since we have a unique identifier, I'm just asking one question.
Yes. But if we talk about aggregate data, as you mentioned a number of times, can you give us an example of how many data points are included in that aggregate data that is provided to InBloom? We talk about hundreds of different data points that are collected and provided. What's the aggregate data?
So it would be things like assessment data at the aggregate level. So a district A would be able to see how their students did in comparison to students from District B. That's an example of the kind of thing that would be available in that way. But we actually have on the website a list of the data elements that would go to InBloom, and that's listed all of the data elements that are collected by the state, not all of which go to InBloom, although it's worth saying that those data elements that are collected by the state are also stored with third-party providers at the state and district level in a variety of ways. And the question really is, what's the right set of security protocols, privacy protocols? There are very strict federal and state laws and regulations on data privacy.
My only, I'll just add one follow-up, and I apologize. I have been on the InBloom site, and I have seen their disclaimer with regard to not being responsible for data. There has to be more of an accountability, I would think, if we're going to entrust an organization or not-for-profit with all of this information. And they have a disclaimer on their very own website. One. Two, do we not have a procedure in place already whereby our school districts provide information to the state education department through BOCES? And information is already collected and aggregated through BOCES, and it exists, it works. We have a BOCES system that is designed to take that information. It's already there. Is that not a more appropriate way to have
the opportunity to clarify. So, one, the disclaimer that InBloom has is to say that it's very consistent with what third-party providers generally say. They will take all security measures. They are accountable under federal and state law for any breaches. But one advantage that InBloom has over most of the third-party providers that store student data is that their data are encrypted in storage and encrypted in transfer. So even if someone were to breach InBloom's data system, the information that they would have access to would be encrypted. So that is a very high standard for data security. As we look at what districts are doing throughout the state, many districts have 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, or more systems, third-party systems to which they are providing information and which are providing them with tools. And so there's a broader question about data security. And I think there's both the state level and the federal level an opportunity to even strengthen some of the penalties, for example, around breach under federal and state law. But with respect to actually what New Bloom is doing, it is very similar to what is done by a variety of third-party providers, including the BOCES. Many of the BOCES services are provided in partnership with a third-party provider. What they aren't able to do in the way that InBloom is to provide these data portals that we committed to provide, that we are providing for very low cost to the state, with the intention of making available a teacher portal and a parent portal in districts that otherwise wouldn't have access to those.
Through 1450.
Yeah.
Through 1450.
I'd just like to say that with data requirements increasing consistently each year, I think it's important to recognize that there is a person that is sending that data, and now if you want that to be relevant data for your teacher to use those tools and for your parent to view those, reflections in the InBloom portal, it's important to know that there is an effect of the data requirements that will be refreshed. I guess it would have to be every day then for it to be relevant to use in the classroom or, to reflect at the parent level as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Andrea Bergen from the Pearl Place School District, followed by Henry Zanetti.
Hello, thank you. Commissioner King, you've listened this evening and many times you've listened to the concerns, the growing concerns of parents, teachers, and educators around the area. But the problem is, I feel you have yet to hear us. We need to know that our pleas for our children are not falling on deaf ears. The sign of a true leader is not to have an immovable, static view on decisions made. Not to stand by an ideal that has proven itself to be ineffective, but to stand in front of those who have put their trust in you and say, I was wrong. I'm listening, what can I do? We the people deserve to be heard. And I, as a parent, need to be heard. I am now going to ask my one selected question, and I am hoping and praying that you hear me, and that I will get one straight answer. If I, as a parent, send a letter to your office, my superintendent, and building principals stating that I do not give permission for my children's personal information to be stored in Bloom or elsewhere, will my request be granted, or will my children's information continue to be collected and stored not only without my permission, but against my will? If a letter is not sufficient, then what steps do I need to take to ensure that my children's personal information remains private?
On the first part of your question, I'm listening very carefully to the conversation. There may be places ultimately where we disagree. I believe in the work on the Common Core, and I've seen it succeeding classroom after classroom around the state. So after this conversation, I still believe in the Common Core. Now, are there adjustments that we can make and will make? Absolutely. On the point about data, the data that's collected by the state is collected pursuant to a variety of federal and state laws and regulations to support the operation of schools. We can't process state aid data unless we know how many students are enrolled in a given district and who they are. There are a series of federal requirements, whether it's around grants or graduation rates and so forth.
And that I understand.
All of which requires information to be collected about each student. The key is that the information has to be secure and has to be safe and has to be accessed only by those who need to access it for educational purposes. So we could never have a system where no information was collected about students and have the good functioning of school districts and school systems. Information is a part of the good operation.
And I understand, in educational information such as, report cards, test grades, absences, that's fine. Information such as address, IEPs, diagnosis, those types of things do not need to be
to students who have an IEP that don't apply when the students don't have an IEP. So we do have to have information on whether or not the student has an IEP.
But can you guarantee me that in the future, no school, no corporation, no business, when my son applies for a job, that they're not going to be able to buy the information that says, well, he has this diagnosis, so I don't know if we want to hire him, although he may be perfectly suited for the job. Can you assure me that that will not happen?
The data that is stored, I can give that assurance in the same way that any state agency or school district could.
Which means you can't.
Data are collected and we do everything possible to ensure the security of that data. Data cannot be sold. Whether it's InBloom or any other third-party provider, they are strictly prohibited by law from selling the data. So
Yes, but InBloom is not impenetrable. It can be found. It can be hunted. I mean, Sachem School District just had a leak of all of its private information.
Anytime you have data collected, there is a security risk. So you're right, there's an inherent security risk. But
I'm not willing to take that risk.
Right, but just to be clear, your district, sorry, what district did you say?
I'm Carl Place School District.
Carl Place. Carl Place has a variety of information that they collect, some of which is stored with the state, some of which is stored locally, some of which is likely stored with third-party providers, or third-party providers have access to it in order to provide particular tools. That's true in every school district around the country. So I share your concern about data security and data safety, but the rules that apply to any of those providers are the rules that apply to InBloom, but in fact, InBloom, with the encryption of the data while stored with InBloom and the encryption of the data when it's transferred, has set a higher bar around data security than many third-party providers.
But don't you have input on the rules, on the laws? Can't you help? And so, just to be clear, and I'm sorry, I know other people want to speak. So you are saying that no, if I write a letter saying that I am against this, it will happen regardless?
We can, just as...
Just yes or no?
We cannot say that we're not going to collect data for students and have the good functioning of the school system. We have to have information in order to comply with a series of federal and state laws. When a student is enrolled in a public school, there is information that must be gathered. When a student is enrolled in
not in a private school?
In non-public schools, there is also information that must be gathered.
Follow-up question. And I think a lot of the concern, certainly the concern that I've heard, is that a lot of information is being aggregated in one place, which makes it far easier than to identify the person. Frankly, the more information put in one place, I certainly personally feel more comfortable about information being in various locations, but once you put it all in one place, you're putting entirely too much information about an individual, and when that individual is my child, I'm concerned. So is there a benefit? And here's the follow-up question, and you're not to step on your toes, and I know that we have people waiting. Is there any benefit to the child's education and the quality of the child's education from using a service or a not-for-profit like InBloom, as opposed to continuing to use the models that exist and our school districts have used historically?
So there are two. One is the security standards that are possible by having a provider like InBloom are actually higher than the third-party providers that are used throughout the state and country. That's one. Two, through the use of a tool like InBloom, essentially having a common platform for data management, we can make available the parent portal and teacher portal that are available, those kinds of tools that are available today in most affluent districts, we can make them available to all districts. Those are the two benefits of using a tool like InBloom.
Thank you. Every committee from the Merryl School District, followed by Diane Colbert.
Thank you all for being here tonight and letting us address you. Actually, I'm kind of in a unique position here of having a lot of my questions been asked already and a lot of it answered. But I understand that you're going to prototype this InBloom system primarily New York City schools at first. And I noted this week in the newspapers, Jefferson County, Colorado, which was one of the early proponents of In Bloom and going full bloom with it, has backed off now, and they're going with a very much more limited version of their system. And so I would like to know what your process is going to be to determine how worthwhile this is before you roll it out to the whole state, and before it becomes perhaps another unfunded mandate or we're done without public discussion.
So the process for rolling out the tools, again, it's not, In Bloom is just a service provider on which the data portal tools sit, essentially. So the process for the data portals is that they will be phased in over the next year with access to the teacher portal and teacher tools, and later access to the parent portal and parent tools. It will be a phase-in of the tools that will be available, again, secure, password protected tools that are very similar to tools that are available in many American Southland districts today through a third-party provider of some sort. Districts and states across the country are making decisions about how to approach this work. Many of those who are not using In-Bloom are using other third-party providers, or in the case of Jefferson County, multiple third-party providers to provide a variety of services. If you look at school districts around the state and country, school districts are often using multiple technology providers, third-party providers, with separate passwords to which they are sending personally identifiable information to provide a tool. It may be a math lesson tool, it may be a tool for tracking transportation, it may be a tool for distribution of meals. The only thing that's different here is that the In-Bloom strategy is a way to lower the cost of what's called data integration, where the data has to go back and forth between the district and the provider, each of those separate tools. But again, to the core of the question, the In-Bloom portals will phase portals built on In-Bloom will phase in over time over the next year.
But will that be a cost that each local district has to decide on, or do they have the option to decide on it or not?
So initially, no cost. For the first few years of this project, there's no cost. Then, at some point, the districts that have portals that they prefer, that they want to purchase through a third party, which many districts do today, they can continue to purchase those. Or districts may choose to use a portal that's built on In-Bloom as a common data platform, and the hope is that the cost, because multiple districts will be sharing that cost, the cost will be significantly lower. That's the purpose of the In-Bloom project, really lower cost for access to the kinds of teacher portals and parent portals that, again, now are available in affluent districts typically through third-party providers.
Thank you. And just as a last aside, anytime we talk about low costs, I say, please, down with the 2% cap. Thank you.
Diane Colbert, followed by Peggy Moran.
According to New York State's agreement to be part of America Competes and Race to the Top, the vision of the New York State Education Department's P20 longitudinal data system is to link data across 5 state agencies with the goal of following students from early childhood through post-secondary education and employment, along with a planned ID number to track the student for life. New York DMV, the Department of Tax and Finance, and the Department of Health are some of the agencies they're looking to share the data with. Why would the DMV or the Department of Health need to know a child's score on the 3rd grade math assessment? Why should a child's attendance records, including suspensions, be on a person's records when they go apply for a driver's license when they're an adult? What exactly is the benefit of sharing this data?
They don't need that information. They don't need that information, and they wouldn't have it. The only times where those data sharing agreements would come into effect is when there's a purpose to the data sharing. So, for example, today, around the country, the state, many students apply to colleges online, right? One potential benefit of data sharing between SUNY, CUNY, and the State Education Department is to make it easier for students to submit their information online. The only time data will be shared is if there is a specific purpose that is a benefit to the student. But the question about employment information is one of the questions. The Chancellor talked earlier about multiple pathways to graduation. One of the questions that comes up often around career and technical education is we have information about how students are doing after they graduate when they get to college. And we use that information to inform decision-making at the state level. But we don't have information about how students are doing when they enter the workforce directly from the CTE program. So potential future use of the longitudinal data system, part of the federal law and federal funding, not just in New York, but across the country. One potential use would be to be able to know how students are doing when they enter the workforce from the career and technical education program. But again, the information will only be used that's personally identifiable if there's a direct purpose for that student. Otherwise, the information will just be used in an aggregate. So you're right. I agree.
Sharing through agencies, that's correct. I understand that you want data, and it can, if it's used properly and on a needs-to-know basis.
Exactly.
It can be used to drive instruction. I understand that. I understand how it can be a helpful tool to the teachers. Teachers that I had struggled to just fine without all that data mining. Like, share it with the agencies. Once it leaves New York State, and now I have a problem with it.
So just to be clear, it won't be shared unless there is a specific purpose. The data sharing agreements, which are common across state agencies, are only for purposes, only for necessary purposes. So for example, in order for the state to receive certain federal funds, we have to convey to the federal government this many students are in X category. We have this many English language learners in this school district. So that's an example of sharing data between the state and the federal government. That's what that is meant to describe. Agencies being able to share information that is relevant to the work of the agencies with each other. It's not sharing it's not saying anyone at the DMV can access personally identifiable information and store it with the state education department or vice versa.
I'm listening. And you're explaining, so it's hard to do both. So the question is, what possible use could DMV have of a student's data, right? That's
right. I understand what you want to do with it as far as New York State, but New York State, I'm looking at New York State data. New York State's vision is to share this data across agencies. So maybe I should be asking Governor Cuomo and not you. What is his plan with this data?
But that's the thing, it's not to share the data across agencies. It's to make possible sharing of specific pieces of information that are relevant to work of agencies. Specifically on the DMV, one of the challenges of developing parent portals is how does the parent validate their identification. So the current model, to think about how school districts verify parent information, is that parents are given a password by the school district. The vision behind including the DMV and a potential data sharing agreement is that the parent's driver's license number could in theory be used as a way to verify parent identification for the purposes of the parent portal. It is not to say that data from the state education department is shared generally with the DMV or vice versa.
Let's just follow, if I may, on one point here. And I know we have one more question waiting. I think part of the concern, and you've heard it, certainly I heard it, is that those policies can change. That someone can make a decision at some point that would make that information available for something else. Whether it's available to potential employers, whether it's available for graduates in college and graduate school, and at some point, although it's not available, although it's not what you're foreseeing, it's not necessary today. The fact that you've aggregated that data then makes it a potential target for someone to go out there and data mine that data because it is there and because it is available. And certainly there's a danger, perceived and real, in aggregating that much data and then allowing it to be there to be targeted for what someone may consider in the future to be the greater good. And the greater good cannot come from the privacy needs that we have for our children.
So the sharing of data is restricted to a very narrow set of purposes by current federal and state law. Restricted to very narrow purposes. It is true that one day the federal or state law with respect to data systems might change. But in actuality, this work that we're doing on Fiscal is raising the level of security and privacy of data. Having data stored in encrypted form is a significant improvement over how data is stored by many third-party providers.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Maria. Thank you. From the New Heights Park.
Thank you, Commissioner King, for coming and listening to us this evening. The last 15, 20 minutes has really heightened my question, and I scaled it down a lot because you answered many points. But I hear the frustration and the fear of the parents, being one myself. But my concern then is that this is a major concern. It's taking over board meetings. It's taking over many places where it's stopping us from doing the work that we need to do as educators. Why hasn't the race to the top money been used to fund repositories in the state education department instead of acquiring a private company to do this? Why haven't we used money to develop our own repositories? This would alleviate so many of the concerns that we have here, and parents would start to gain more faith that the data was confidential.
It's really the same reason that districts use a variety of third-party providers for data purposes. The cost of developing the capacity to store the data in a single place with all of the coders and so forth that we needed to create that kind of data infrastructure really is the rare entity that can afford that. Data stored with data tools are generally provided by third parties. That's true not just for the state education department, but for other states and the school districts.
I think now that we've truly entered into a new stage of real high-stake testing, and I think it would be important to consider where else we could get funded to make the state education department house the repositories. I know you said it's extremely expensive, but from what I hear from being an administrator and being a vice president of the school board, it's consuming so much of the time and energy from administrators, teachers, and parents to be able to move forward and do what we need to do. Thank you.
I mean, we all collective, but one of the things that we have seen from these conversations on Instagram is that collectively we have a lot of work to do to make sure that folks understand all of the data privacy considerations, not just at the state level, but at the local level. And ask across those 5, 7, whatever the number is, of tools that are provided at the local level, what are the data security provisions for each of those as well. So I do think, unfortunately, we're at a time, and not just in education, but across sectors, where we need to have a lot of conversation about data security and data options for data security in the best ways.
You know, the medical field is going through the exact same conversation.
But allocation. So basically what you're saying is that you can take any information for the benefit of whatever it is for the state education department and do as you please regardless of the voice of the people. And I have an issue with that. I have an issue.
Can I finish?
I'm sorry.
That's okay. I would just like to finish. You know, I think, and I know you brought up the medical field, and I understand that, but right here, we're here as parents and as educators. We have so many variables that's stopping the Common Core standards from being successful. One of them, and a major one from what I hear from this lady and from all the parents that we've been dealing with, is a private sector housing all this information. So I think if you look at all the variables that we dealt with tonight, from APPR to Common Core standards to In Bloom, that we really need to start focusing on one area, and let's try to move that forward so we can start moving out and get back to focusing on what's most important, and that's the education of the children. Thank you.
One is that the data that are stored at the local level and at the state level are stored with third-party providers. If not in Bloom, they are still stored with third-party providers. So the question is, what are the security provisions of each of those third-party providers at the school and district level? With respect to the Parental to Health, there are a set of very strict federal rules about what health information can be shared and used when. There are similarly strict federal laws and rules. They differ, but they are intended to strictly narrow when data can be used, who can access it, for what purposes. District data that is collected in education cannot be sold, it cannot be shared with third parties, unless the only way the data can be shared is to provide a specific service to the district to support their students.
I think, Commissioner and Chancellor, first let me thank you for being here these last 3 hours and answering the questions. And I think hearing certainly the level of frustration is concerned. Before I wrap up, I wanted to take the opportunity to thank the Mineola School District once again, Dr. Nagler, certainly the members of our student government who were here and participated throughout the day, the superintendents, the teachers, the parents, the students, the educators who coordinated, collaborated in making this forum possible. I want to also, personally, I want to apologize to everyone who posed a question and didn't have the opportunity to ask it tonight. Because, and again, I apologize. It's 7 o'clock, we started at 4, we went to close at 6:30, it's 7 o'clock. And there were a number of people in the room, there were 250 questions that were posed. We tried to narrow it down to 40, and we were able to ask just over 30. So my apologies to everyone who wished the opportunity to ask a question, but didn't have that opportunity. Having said that, again, I want to thank the Commissioner and the Chancellor for being here. But I want to make a point before we close, and certainly I wanted to give the opportunity to the Commissioner and the Chancellor to close as well. In all of my years, have rarely, if ever, I don't think I've ever seen an issue or a number of issues in which there is such uniform opposition than the issues that we've discussed today. And it comes across demographics, it cuts across geography, it cuts across suburban, urban, and rural areas, it cuts across parent groups, teachers, administrators, students, who are concerned and genuinely concerned and oppose changes that are taking place. Maybe they don't oppose standards, but they are certainly widespread and uniform opposition with regard to how the standards are being implemented. And certainly that's what I've seen, that's what I've heard. And what I would ask is, from a forum like this, that we take the questions, we take the suggestions, and we take the opportunities that there may be to go back and recognize that we do have to tweak some of the decisions that have been made, and there are ways that those can be changed. Hopefully, again, keeping in mind the most important thing is how does it benefit the education of our child. So I will close with a quote from a favorite of mine, Benjamin Franklin. Franklin said, do not fear mistakes. You will know failure. Continue to reach out. And I think we can use that tonight, and hopefully we can learn and use that quote to continue to reach out and to understand that, to acknowledge that there may be a mistake and to look to rectify that mistake is an important part